Excuse me, do you know who's been cut out? I'm a bit confused. We didn't catch the name of who's not going to be here.
Address that video longitude. Right down to the I think not even beyond the minutes, down to the second. And then they used to write them in I think they were meant to be intimidating, in red tints. Oh, what a great guy. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of one of his students' names, in German.
Oh yes, I know who you're talking about. Galway.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
It's supposed to be a blind yes, I know all those guys.
Welcome back, everybody. Stefan Skrimshire is in Leeds. He would have been here, but his wife is expecting a baby imminently, and he was terrified that if he came down, the inevitable would happen. So, he's very kindly recorded his paper, and then we're going to Skype with him straight after that. He's sitting there watching this at home. Hello, Stefan. We'll call you as soon as we've seen your recording. Let's go. It's called
Hello,
What's
everybody.
Bad About
My name's
Doomsday?
Stefan Skrimshire. I want to thank Simon for the opportunity to give this talk and to apologise that I can't be with you in person. I very much hoped to be part of this conference on climate and apocalypse, to share conversations with all of you. This is a theme very close to my research. But I do hope that we get to have some exchange after this, and I would welcome any feedback on what I have to say. So the title of this talk is What is Bad About Doomsday? And it is really trying to bring together a couple of threads of some recent thinking about philosophical and theological understandings of extinction. And in particular, I'm interested in how apocalyptic thought either influences or challenges the way that our notions of time and extinction work. So our temporal frameworks for thinking about the possibility of future extinction. So the term mass extinction has become a watchword of climate change prediction, with greater success, I suggest, than the word Anthropocene, even though the former is often discussed in the context of the latter. And considering its rhetorical potential, this is unsurprising. Earlier this year, for example, the Daily Mail ran a story with the following headline: "Will global warming lead to the apocalypse? Earth's worst mass extinction was caused by runaway climate change, and experts warn it could happen again." So this refers to a proposed comparison between current rates of species loss and the previous mass extinctions, including the Great Permian mass extinction 250 million years ago, in which 90% of all life was wiped from the surface of the Earth. And paleobiologists think that the causes of this mass eradication of life may include climate change. But what is noticeable about the way that the report runs is it's able to bring a world separated from us by unfathomably large geological timescales to bear upon our present life and fears. So it's a world involving the great dying of most species, but also lethal acid rain, volcanic eruptions, widespread forest fires. A world we can very much imagine as our own. And in similar vein, witness recent claims that an end to Homo sapiens could, as a knock-on effect of mass extinction, be witnessed within 100 years, a claim made first by the microbiologist Frank Fenner in 2010, and then 5 years later by the science writer David Auerbach. And these were and are highly speculative and attention-grabbing claims, also made arguably on behalf of an urgent moral cause, but I wonder whether what they would command half as much attention if the future scenarios they depict had been temporally more distant or more ambiguous. And if they couldn't, I'm interested in what this tells us about the uses and usefulness of linking apocalyptic and millennial belief to the moral crisis of climate change. And I want to address that concern by bringing together two types of inquiry that I think are normally kept far apart. The first is philosophical, and it asks broadly what type of responses the possibility of human extinction generates or ought to generate, and then what do those responses tell us about ourselves and what we care about. The second inquiry is more theological and asks whether there is anything specific to Jewish and early Christian literature labelled apocalyptic that might illuminate, problematize, or otherwise contribute to that philosophical question. So let me turn first to the philosophical mode of inquiry. What sort of wrong or harm does extinction represent? And there are fewer philosophical studies responding to this question than you might expect. But one of the most intriguing recent attempts comes from the philosopher Sam Scheffler. In his 2013 Tanner Lectures, Death and the Afterlife, Scheffler considers what it is that makes the prospect of the end of the world so disturbing to humans. In essence, his argument comes down to this. First, it is reasonable to suppose that the anticipation of an imminent end to all human existence would render much of what we do in the present meaningless, or at least greatly diminished in value. And second, if we accept this claim, this reveals important things about human value. More specifically, it reveals an implied connection between ethics and temporality, because it means that the value that we ascribe to projects in our lives is dependent upon some notion of their continuation, their afterlife. By afterlife, Scheffler means the continuation of human lives in the plural after we are dead. He is not referring to the religious belief in personal immortality. Let's look at how he arrives at this conclusion. He asks us to imagine a scenario in which we knew that 30 days after our own natural death, the Earth would be utterly destroyed. With this knowledge, he asks, would we seriously find value in the pursuits we currently undertake? His scenario assumes unequivocal epistemic certainty. There is no doubt that there will be no world 30 years after our personal life ends. And the point of the scenario is that it forces us to consider whether our present projects, values and commitments are dependent upon at least some minimal guarantee of temporal continuity. And Scheffler concludes that for a significant amount of them, this is absolutely right. Either we would find less value in, or perhaps give up entirely, such activities as researching a cure for cancer, having children, or campaigning for the radical reduction of global carbon emissions. Now, clearly he can't base this upon any factual evidence, but he can appeal to the reasonableness of assuming that people like us would respond in such a way. And he appeals to a scenario sketched in P.D. James's novel Children of Men. That story presents a different scenario to the sudden cataclysmic perspective of a nuclear attack or asteroid strike, by focusing more on the status and quality of being the last humans. In James's novel, the world's human population becomes suddenly infertile, and societies must adjust to being the last generation. The characters in that story become apathetic and despairing, struggling to know what is worth fighting for, what projects are worth continuing, what grounds there are even for pleasure for leading hedonistic lives. And if we find such a reaction plausible, goes the argument, we would reasonably conclude that the worth of most human projects is only coherent alongside the belief in the continuation of the species. And therefore, we ought to care for the continuation of the human species above all things. Now, there have been numerous objections to Scheffler's argument, some of them quite convincing in my view, and many that appear in the same volume that published his thesis. And I don't want to rehearse those objections here in detail. In fact, I want to delimit my criticism to those aspects of it which I believe are representative of a quite widespread assumption about the potential and the function of doomsday scenarios to motivate moral behavior. That assumption is summed up in one of his sub-conclusions, in essence. The afterlife thesis, he believes, is good news for those who are concerned about moral motivation to combat such species-threatening phenomena as climate change, or presumably nuclear war. It is good news because it means that humans are probably a lot less selfish, individualistic, and short-sighted than many of us assumed them to be. And following this, it is reasonable to expect them to do everything in their power to prevent an event that would precipitate their untimely extinction. But for me, what is problematic about this claim is that it requires a minimally clear sense of what would count as a future that is indefinitely long enough, in Scheffler's words, to valorize the commitments of the present. How does one define a healthy and indefinitely long future? The characters in the Children of Men scenario do have a future. They have the rest of their lives. But if we decide that this is too short to motivate meaningful projects of the kind that Scheffler cites, the ones that require some guarantee that the human project itself is continued, we might want to specify where and how that line could be drawn. Would extinction in 2 generations' time provoke the same loss of meaning? How about 3 generations? And the point is true of a concern with the opposite end of the temporal spectrum. Scheffler is also interested in why it is that people tend not to suffer existential crises from the knowledge of our certain extinction in universal heat death in around 6 billion years' time. And this is also a focus of a particular critique by the philosopher Susan Wolfe. Scheffler's reply is that the spatio-temporal scale involved in such reflection is simply too big to get our heads around. This seems like common sense. It comes as no surprise that most people do not have such anxieties as the famous scene in Woody Allen's Annie Hall, which Scheffler cites, in which a young Alvey singer is refusing to do his homework because he's just found out that the universe is expanding and will one day break apart. "What has the universe got to do with it?" replies his mother. "You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding." The comic effect derives from the juxtaposition of mundane cares of the present with what would otherwise be known as cosmic pessimism. But the comedy works because the flip side is also at least plausible. Alvy might have a point. The mundane cares of his mother and teacher are juxtaposed against his justified existential angst that has been suddenly awakened to the ultimate finitude of all things, its common destiny in oblivion. Against this realization, doing your homework suddenly seems pointless. I'd suggest that most of us have had at least occasionally an Alvy Singer moment. But more broadly, this point becomes interesting and problematic element of doomsday rhetoric from the point of view of a phenomenon like climate change. For if the notion of being the last generation is morally and existentially disastrous, it seems to demand that we do clarify more precisely in what sense a long future or a short future consists and can be the basis for our moral deliberation. And it brings us back to the scenario in which a predicted end of the human species within 100 years is presented. What does that tell us about our ability and the grounds for valuing current human projects? Because a scenario closer to home is one in which I know that human extinction will occur at some point in the future, and perhaps closer than had previously been predicted, but I am not certain whether it will be in hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands of years' time. We can extend this ambiguity further by imagining a doomsday scenario in which perhaps not all, but most of humanity is wiped out. Or one in which the quality of life of the remnant of the population is vastly diminished or rendered, in the eyes of some, inhuman. This is arguably the scenario closer to the rhetoric of extinction from climate change scenarios. What if the future of humanity is being certainly curtailed, but within a time frame that is uncertain, and in which our present actions do have a hand? How would we manage the translation of that form of catastrophic imagination into ethical commitment? And it's at this point that I want to turn to the possible theological resourcing of this debate, or at least to turn to how theology might introduce more complexity, more nuance into our understanding of time in this context. When it comes to religious apocalypticism, a common assumption is that this same logic of shortening or quickening, bringing to bear into present lives the prophecy of an incoming future is adopted for a rhetorical purpose. So as Stephen O'Leary writes, one rarely hears, for example, of an apocalyptic movement that predicts global catastrophe and divine judgment to occur hundreds of thousands of years in the future. Such movements only become controversial when their predictions are relevant to the concerns of the present. And this would largely explain the attraction to dispensational millennialists, such as we see in the Rapture Ready website, to the practice of decoding contemporary ecological catastrophes, which recently have begun to include recording species extinctions and an anticipation of a mass extinction event. Christian apocalypse, of course, can resource this imagination very well. In the book of Revelation, the fate of non-human creatures features prominently in the eschatological narrative. For example, in chapter 8, when the sounding of the first trumpet brings death for a third of all living things in the sea. Nevertheless, I want to mention a couple of ways that apocalyptic literature might at least present us with a more complex model of time and the future. And the first thing I would note is that in several cases, apocalyptic literature does not simply provide one authoritative historical narrative. It typically juxtaposes and puts into dualistic tension two forms of time, that of human and creaturely time and that of God's time, the unfolding of prophecy according to God's eternal kingdom. In apocalyptic texts, and for example in the book of Daniel, this takes on the form of depicting the tension between imperial time and the time of the end. So a succession of imperial regimes are prophesied to have their allotted time in which they will rise up against Jerusalem before the end of time, when all human dominion will cease. And as the theologian Lieven Berver has put it in the Christian context, apocalyptic does not merely portray God entering into and directing historical events as chronology. It represents the incursion of God into history as the boundary of time itself, making humans constantly aware of this contrast. Now, on the one hand, this model of time appears overwhelmingly to lend itself to a deterministic perspective of history. Unlike some uses of prophetic literature that might seek to swerve the course of history by warning of cataclysmic consequences of present actions, apocalypses seem like a done deal. One cannot change the events that are revealed because they are unalterable. They are sealed. How then could apocalyptic literature inform ethical thinking about the future? A common assumption is that audiences of more widely eschatological literature, including the letters of St. Paul and parts of the Synoptic Gospels, feared the end of the world in their lifetime and thus abandoned normal ethical social commitments in favour of extreme asceticism, piety, or righteous anger, qualities embodied in figures such as John the Baptist, or embodied in the ascetic demands of the Essene community at Qumran, for example. But the theologian Dale C. Allison also argues that human behaviour in the face of impending doom probably reflected values and beliefs already held rather than introduced new ones. Apocalyptic literature, whilst intensely ethical, as Allison put it, does not create a moral tradition so much as intensify the imperatives of a tradition already held. Thus, on the one hand, for some apocalyptic audiences, nothing at all changes. The imperative is to continue holding on to one's observance of religious law and custom in the face of catastrophe. Such a notion also appeals to the common wisdom and is reflected in some cultural portrayals of Doomsday. So, for example, in the 1998 film Last Night, citizens of Toronto spend their last night on Earth according to a spectrum of impulses and behaviours with which they began, from the hedonistic to the pious to the apathetic. But clearly one of the argued functions of apocalyptic literature is that by bringing the end into proximity with present life, responsibility to one's ethical and religious code is heightened. In a sort of reversal of the afterlife thesis, Allison notes that pious apocalypse audiences would have interpreted them as exhortations to ready themselves by increasing vigilance. The imminence of end times is a safeguard against complacency and procrastination. This is the eschatological sense, for example, of Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish virgins, which divides those who are ready and prepared for the wedding from those who are unprepared. Watch, therefore, for you do not know the hour of his coming. So the ethics of living in apocalyptic time would at least seem to require something of a revelation of a common mortality, including not only my personal extinction, but collective human extinction. A reminder of the death of the world as we know it. But the fact that it does so within frequently coded temporality seems important. In several eschatological texts, there is either an explicit prohibition against predicting the date and time of the eschaton, as with Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, in which he admonishes believers not to consider dates or times, but to be aware only that the day of the Lord will come at a time not of their choosing, like a thief in the night. Or there is a reminder that what is revealed is beyond our comprehension. In Daniel's final vision concerning the resurrection of the dead at the end of time, He sees a man ask the one clothed in linen, "How long shall it be before the end of these wonders?" Daniel cannot understand the answer that he is given and is told, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are to remain secret and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be purified, cleansed, and refined, but the wicked shall continue to act wickedly. None of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand." So time and again in apocalyptic literature, we find this attempt to combine a sense of living in the end times, calling listeners to radically question social and ethical priorities given the proximity of the end, with an awareness that humans are not in control of that timing, and importantly, human folly prevents us from decoding its meaning, from mixing the meanings of near and far. Ethics, the practice of living well, living justly, must operate within this state of uncertainty with regard to the time that remains. So perhaps this is one way that the peculiar genre of apocalyptic literature might contribute to our broader understanding of the complexities about how doomsday arguments work or might work, and how this might inform philosophical and ethical understandings of extinction, particularly the time of extinction. There seems to be a basic weakness in the assumption that many of our ethical commitments only make sense when viewed through, in Sam Scheffler's words, a proprietary attitude to valuing. That is, where the idea of some indefinite control of the future, of owning the future, guarantees meaning to one's present actions. Whereas apocalyptic discourse is at least more complex. It is about the juxtaposition of the near and the far, the intensely present and the cosmically distant, the very boundary of time brought in our midst. And Allison's point about apocalyptic ethics rings true for doomsday arguments as well. Introducing a time limit to human existence will not introduce a new moral tradition. It may heighten the ones that we already have, but equally it may deaden them. What needs reinventing are the traditions themselves. Thank you very much.
So we're just going to Skype. Hi, Stefan.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Brilliant, okay.
Hi, everybody.
So I'm going to ask, is there a question? It's not quite happened yet, I don't think, but it's imminent, I believe. I explained to everyone why you couldn't be here today.
Right. You've got me reaching for my phone.
I'm going to start with Chris.
That's not happened yet.
Start with Chris and I'll come to you, Rupert, okay?
Thanks, Stefan. I enjoyed that. I agree with the basic thesis, but I want to just say two things. First of all, I think I want to put in a plea for the prophetic discourse in the Hebrew Bible, that I think that the doomsday scenario, which one finds in a lot of the prophetic oracles, I think is really important in our present situation, and I think needs rescuing from those texts which actually kind of make it that it's going to work out okay in the end. And that's just kind of one thing just to say about the importance of that. With regard to the what you call Christian apocalyptic theology, I think what we also need to rescue is the fact that if the New Testament means anything to me at all, it's about communities trying to work out how it is they are living in a situation in which they are believing that the end of this age is coming and a new age is coming, and yet at the same time are wanting to bring about a degree of transformation. If I could link it with something that we heard this morning about the relationship between transition and transformation, I think if the New Testament isn't about that, I'll eat my hat.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of those comments, and I'm certainly not arguing for one. I'm not presenting religious sources, New Testament sources, as providing one kind of answer. My own example, the texts that I've been looking at, are mostly interested in the way that they deal with this complex notion of time and an incoming future and crisis. But you're absolutely right that is not the whole picture, and I think one of the fruits of much broader studies of apocalyptic literature is that you can talk about political liberation, you can talk about the understanding it as a story of from the viewpoint of the oppressed. All of those things can be read in different ways. I think what they certainly show is that there are, human history has a very rich traditions of understanding and responding to global crises. So I guess it's a reminder for us that our situation isn't unique in certain respects. In some respects it is, but certainly in terms of responses to crises, I don't think it is.
Thanks, Stefan. So I want to start off with what I think is a great work in recent years that I think makes the point that you were trying to make. So I'm thinking of Lars von Trier's masterwork, Melancholia, which is about how we should comport ourselves in the final days, hours, minutes, and seconds of our common existence. But it seems to me that while it's an absolutely crucial point, and it makes very clearly the point that many very important human activities do not require a long future in which to unfold. It seems to me that Scheffler's point that many important human activities do require a long future in which to unfold is also equally true. So I was unclear. It seemed to me that you were trying to make some kind of criticism of the children of men in relation to this, but it's unclear to me that works, or why it need contradict the kind of point we get from Melancholia. So in Children of Men, it seems to me what we get, and I think, by the way, we get it much better in the film than in the book.
Yeah, I agree.
We get a picture of an alarmingly plausible descent into selfishness and nihilism if we seem to be deprived of a long future. And one lesson we could learn from that is the desirability, not the necessity, but the desirability for meaning in our lives, of life going on, and ourselves not being extinguished, and being able to produce future generations and so on. And it seems to me that point is obviously given additional force when it's considered in relation to our actual relation to a situation like the climate crisis, i.e. that we are actually culpable. The crisis actually is avoidable, or in principle soluble, and that makes the whole thing a lot worse. So the lesson I took from Children of Men is that it actually is quite a powerful way of making a point about how crucial it is for many of the things that we do, not by any means for all, that we have a long future ahead of us as a species. That point is brought into stronger relief when, in the scenario we actually have, unlike in either of those two films, the extinguishing event is avoidable.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. So my criticism of Scheffler is why he is that by picking the scenario presented by Children of Men, he is simplifying his the premise for his argument by saying, well, what would happen if we knew with certainty, with near certainty, that humans would cease to exist after a certain time. And I think what that doesn't show is the challenge of making ethical sense of an ambiguous stretch of time before us. And one of the things I didn't put, I sort of cut out of my talk, was to mention a contrast with something that you mentioned in your talk this morning, McCarthy's The Road. And one of the more profound aspects of the Road's narrative is that it does exactly present a scenario. The relationship between the father and the son is one in which the thought experiment unfolding through their narrative is this radical uncertainty about whether they're the last humans. So before they meet other humans, the father asks the son, or the son asks the father, what if we're the last ones on the earth? And I think the father says, how would we know, and why would that matter? And it becomes a theological discussion, because the son says, well, God would know, surely. And what I think McCarthy is doing that a scenario like The Children of Men cannot do is explore precisely ethics in epistemic uncertainty. So what does one do with the rest of one's existence, not knowing the road before you, or even the extent of the damage to which one lives in? So it's not so much a criticism of The Children of Men as why one would use that as an exploration for morality surrounding climate change. And I just think that narratives that explore that ambiguous space are much more useful for us, because they're close to the situation that we are in. We are not facing a certain asteroid strike. We're not facing a virus that's going to kill off the human population. We are in a situation in which the future is very ambiguous. And if we leave it to the sort of media portrayal of, right, some scientists said we've got 100 years, so I'll take that for granted. That's fairly useless in terms of helping humans to face ambiguous futures. But I absolutely agree with you that The Children of Men scenario does have something interesting to say, but for me, it doesn't really get at the complexity at all.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just a quick comeback. I think I understand that point better now. But it does seem to me that I still think we can have a kind of both-and situation here. I think your point is right, but it seems to me clear that we can learn stuff from both Children of Men and from Melancholia about the actual situation that we are in, partly by contrast. We might think of these situations as what Wittgenstein calls objects of comparison. So we learn from the similarities and from the differences. We don't think of it all as just a kind of modeling exercise where all that we can be interested in is the similarities. But also the aspects that they do bring out. So, for example, something seems to me one learns from Melancholia, although obviously it's also in ancient Stoicism and so on, is that even if you did know that there was an absolute cutoff, that would not render all aspects of life meaningless. And that's a very important point that, for example, it would be good if more of the protagonists of The Children of Men themselves, as it were to learn.
Yes, in fact, in the book, which is, I don't think it's a very well-written book, but one of the things it does that the film doesn't is it has certain characters portray that perspective, so they keep fighting. They are holding the flame against the apathy, against the destruction. So yeah, I take that point.
Stefan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon. And I've enjoyed the talk so far this morning, and I'll continue watching if they're live. So thanks very much for that.
Wonderful, and good luck in the very near future.
The very near future. Yes, thank you. Okay.
Paul. So pleasure now to introduce Paul Reid-Bowen.
Okay. My claim today is that the ways in which we frame and mythologise our current age may require some serious reassessment. And I propose that there are alternative ways of thinking more appropriate for understanding and perhaps even living through this age. There are, though, a couple of assumptions at work here, and I want to just kind of lay my assumptions out quite quickly. First, I'll just remember to click on. First, I assume that we are indeed living in turbulent, catastrophic, or perhaps even apocalyptic times. Everyone here can probably generate their own litanies of crisis and despair to populate this period. The climatological, global warming, extreme weather events, weather weirding, but also ocean acidification, melting ice caps and rising tides, deforestation, habitat loss, and the sixth mass extinction, environmental degradation, pollution and toxification, resource depletion and scarcity, peak oil, peak water, peak everything, resurgent nationalisms, militarisms, terrorisms, the list goes on. Second, I assume that we are living in a world of more than human systems, networks and assemblages. The world is composed and comprised of numerous complex systems of materialities, information and energy. Now, this is probably not too contentious a claim at first blush, but it may become more so as I proceed with this talk. And I will point many of you here towards a wealth of philosophical material that has been concerned with theorising and conceptualising the organisation and complexity of the world in other than human terms. The works of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Manuel de Landa particularly, Bruno Latour, Jane Bennett, the new materialists, the speculative realists, the object-oriented ontologists. These are all valuable introductions to these ideas of a more than human world. And their metaphysical ideas are very much in the background of my talk today. And I can talk to them all later if you want to, but I'm just kind of putting them out there as kind of part of my kind of worldview. Now, taken together, the aforementioned assertions of a world of multiple crises and a world of complex systems provides a very useful point of entry to the question of naming and framing our age. Now, the popular terminology here is Crutzen and Sturmer's The Anthropocene, a term we can date back to about 2000, and we're all familiar with it now. It's in the popular press, it's everywhere. This is the age in which humanity have become a geological force, an agent of change. There are, though, alternatives, a whole raft of them, all of which attempt to capture certain salient features of this period. And you may have your own favourites. I'll give you a few. Jason Moore's Capitalocene, Norgard's Econocene, McBrien's, I like this one, Necrocene, Derek Jensen's Sociopocene, Hornberg's Technocene, Donna Haraway's recent Thulucene, and I take my point of departure from Haraway, actually. I disagree. There's another paper where I disagree with Haraway's term and go in a different direction. It's becoming a long list, and it's really a veritable Rorschach test of narratives, methodologies, and theories for making sense of our age. So, my aim today is to unapologetically add to this embarrassment of riches. The theorising, narrating and naming of our current moment in history with sustained attention to ecological and planetary impacts and forces is a necessary and vital activity. And this is particularly so when our current concepts and narratives are proving woefully inadequate to the task of engaging with the wickedly complex problems and existential dilemmas of our time. Alex Evans has recently asked, What can we do when evidence and the arguments aren't enough to affect behaviour and address crises such as global warming? His answer: we need to engage with the mythic imagination. We are suffering, he says, from a myth gap, and that's the title of his recent book, and need to find new ways of narrating our situation in an ecologically responsive manner. Similarly, Paul Kingsnorth has speculated as to whether some of our well-worn narratives of environmentalism may not be working. As he's asked, what if it isn't a battle or a war to save the earth? What then? Perhaps another mythic narrative is needed. New stories and conceptual frames may be required. Now, the mythic narrative and conceptual frame that I want to propose comes from an unusual source. The writings of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, some of you may be familiar with this, but for those of you who don't know, Lovecraft was a writer of weird fiction and horror short stories and novellas in the 1920s. He articulated a mythos and a universe of inhuman forces, where barely comprehensible alien agencies and elder gods, such as Cthulhu, interacted with humanity, often only tangentially, and whose true natures and purposes were capable of severely challenging human cognition, sanity, and existence. His contribution to popular culture is particularly significant in this regard, in regard to this delineation of immense alien horrors existing on the very fringes of human awareness and understanding. Why then Lovecraft? How might the evocation of a 1920s pulp horror writer have any application to our current ecological crises or a gap in our mythic imagination? So, my proposal is that we do, in fact, inhabit a more than human world of monstrous agencies. Tolling of the bell. Indeed. So we do inhabit a world of more than human agencies, analogous to Lovecraft's powers and aliens. That is, there are alien powers already here, living alongside us, around us, within us, and through us. The world... Sorry, I should have advanced. The world is populated by a multitude of non-human systems and agencies that fit the descriptor of Lovecraftian monsters and the term the Cthulhucene remarkably well. And I've just got on the slide actually, I'm talking about Cthulhu rather than Thulhu. That's kind of Haraway's term, and there is kind of a difference, but I can maybe it seems very small, look at the spelling. But when Haraway talks about this, Haraway's talking about earthly powers. She's evoking the kind of the Greek chthonic of the earth, the underworld. But this is a little bit different from it's very different from Lovecraft. So the world is populated by a multitude of non-human systems and agencies that fit this term much better. But to name but a few of these, one might point towards nation-states, multinational corporations, media networks, financial markets, institutions, whether religious, political, legal, social, cities, and even algorithms. But they also include ecosystems, Gaia, maybe. Each of these things is an emergent system, an actor, an agentival assemblage in its own right. Their origins may in part be human, not always. They may be partially composed of humans, but they have long since escaped human control, human dependency, or even human comprehension in some cases. We can affect them, we are affected by them, but we are not they. So while we tend to fixate on human agency and much prefer to reduce the world to the human, this is just an evolutionary feature or a hangover, one of many evolved cognitive biases, filters and mechanisms we have. But it's quite understandable. It's also Crucially, it's also a partial explanation of why we are failing to address the climatological and ecological crises of our age. Most of these crises and problems are systemic. They are the product of immensely complex, more than human assemblages and these emergent systems. They lack, or more accurately transcend, human intention, control and agency. We understandably focus our attentions on human personalities, their motives, their values and their many vices. You can probably put in your own names there. I'll avoid naming particular politicians. But without clearly recognising that these are shaped, enabled and affected by much larger systems and agencies whose logics and principles are not our own. So I'm not arguing here that there are the elder gods of Lovecraft's mythos literally exist, as interesting as that might be, but rather there are autonomous monstrous powers and systems that exceed and affect us in ways we barely comprehend, which certainly do exist. Indeed, some of these monstrous entities may be far more dangerous than Lovecraft's Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep or Azathoth, and they may be similarly inscrutable, resistant to harm and sanity destroying. We may interact with their followers, their creations and their nefarious projects, but we never quite touch or know them directly. And this is not an appeal to imagination and fiction alone. I am making claims here about the kind of entities that exist. And these claims rest on metaphysical frameworks that have varying degrees of conceptual and theoretical elaboration and precision. Now, this isn't to say they're true, but they have their own defenders. They have measures of coherence, adequacy, and applicability to the world that can be assessed, evaluated, and tested and argued about. These theories, though, all lend support to my claim that no, really, there are monsters. Thus, we may prefer to think of the world, its problems and its inhabitants. I mean, the way we think about the world and its problems and its inhabitants may be very seriously askew. There may not be monsters under the bed, but they may be hiding in plain sight, or else lurking just outside our current conceptual frameworks and narratives. So, what's the benefits of the Cthulhu Scene as a mythic and metaphysical narrative, or what Jane Bennett calls an onto story? Firstly, it's not a myth of human exceptionalism, human progress, or human supremacy. So it's very amenable to ecological thinking and environmental ethics. We inhabit a more than human world, where human purposes are not in control of events. There is also no simple techno-fix for our problems. Neither are humanity the crown of evolution or the direction bearer. And I probably ought to flick forwards. Neither are we the direction bearer of existence. Second, the Cthulhu Scene is not a story that supports the idea that humanity can liberate or save the earth. Insofar as there are conflicts, and there are conflicts, these are not ones where humanity stands separate from or above other entities as potential stewards, saviours or messiahs. At best, we are all in this together, in a radically cosmopolitan or maybe anarchic ecology of things. Just move on a little bit. Now, the ecological philosopher Tim Morton's theory of a dark ecology comes close to evoking this mythos of the Cthulhu Scene. Amongst his many ideas, and Morton is very good for ideas, he's like an idea engine, not a very systematic thinker, but he generates lots of ideas, is interesting. Morton suggests that we are like characters in noir fiction, where we come to realise that we are not the heroes, but are implicated in the villainy. However, many of the actors in the Cthulhu Scene are far stranger and more monstrous than any we might find in noir fiction. The characters of Lovecraft's horror fiction are a far better representation of our current situation. The Cthulhu Scene provides an apocalyptic myth that is wholly appropriate for our age. To develop another of Morton's claims, in a sense, the apocalypse has already happened. Or rather, we may have already crossed the event horizon of the apocalypse, but we've not yet realised this fact. We've been living in a world of monstrous powers and agencies for much of our history. We've simply been too preoccupied with cultural navel-gazing and our own subjectivity to take note of this fact. And it's perhaps only indigenous and animist peoples who've retained a fairly developed sense of participating in a world of other than human persons. But that's kind of maybe another talk about animism. Now, if you aren't convinced, bear with me. Try and imagine us as struggling to survive and flourish within a world populated by monstrous powers and agencies that we don't fully understand or control. Nations, governments, institutions, corporations, mindless bureaucracies. These are some of the modern leviathans and monsters with whom we share this world. We rarely think of them as such, while at the same time being complicit with and enslaved by them in numerous ways. It is something called civilization and its various components, extractive industries, financial markets, corporations, it's this which is the heat engine driving global warming. A monstrous assemblage within which we live and from which we draw certain benefits. Who then, you might ask, is really in control? The attempt to grasp and articulate the complexity of this state of affairs is often to risk one's sanity. This is little different from the monstrous world and situation outlined in Lovecraft's writings. We are poorly equipped, cognitively speaking, to comprehend the more than human world we inhabit. It's too systemically complex. And also, it's too difficult to comprehend the extended timescales and materialities involved. Plus, compared to these larger entities on whom our continued existence seems to rely, we are transitory and remarkably limited. As with Lovecraft's investigators, the struggle is one to live in a world where these immense powers operate according to imperatives and logics of their own. Sometimes there will be conflicts, as these alien imperatives threaten our immediate or long-term existence. But these are really best understood in terms of survival, predation, or simply the fight for coexistence. I think I probably ought to have skipped forward a little bit. I'll skip over that. So, it may be argued that the conceiving of such things as... I'll go one forward one, actually. Here we go. It may be argued that conceiving of such things as Monsanto or ExxonMobil as monstrous agentival powers is not quite right. You know, it may be disempowering, anti-humanist, maybe they're just human constructs. But actually, this may be a vital step towards changing our relationship to them and affecting their behaviour in more life-affirming or simply more effective ways. They are not us. And they're not us except in the sense that we participate in and are affected by them. They follow their own codes or desires, and we certainly don't control them. The best we can do, I think, is study these strange strangers as countless animist societies have studied their wider communities and liaise with them in whatever ways are appropriate and efficacious. Now, what might follow from this, I don't know. I think it's too soon to say. But it's about shifting the way we frame the world, the things we perceive as actual entities. Celebration, resistance, predation, I don't know. I've used the word monster pejoratively today, and the monsters of Lovecraft's mythos are often hazardous and hostile to human life. Maybe ExxonMobil and Monsanto are as well. But monsters need not necessarily be fought or slain, although sometimes they need to be. They can be lived alongside. Is my relationship with a corporation, a community, a nation, a symbiotic one, a parasitic one, a mutualist one, or something else entirely? I'm not sure. This warrants careful reflection. The upshot of my talk is that we inhabit not the age of humanity, the Anthropocene, but an age of monsters, the Cthulhu Scene. This is an apocalyptic myth appropriate for our age of climatic upheaval. The claims may seem outlandish, maybe, but in the interest of the flourishing of our wider communities, there is a need to take account of all the agents involved. Minimally, as Isabel Stengers has very evocatively noted, entities have to be recognised as such, lest we be devoured or overpowered by them. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Questions for Paul? Chris, then Ruth.
Thanks very much indeed. Just a quick comment. To the list, you might add the subject matter of the last talk, which was apocalyptic literature, which is an attempt to engage the mythic imagination. And one of the things which only gets to the margins of biblical scholarship is the fact that language in the New Testament about the principalities and powers is exactly what you've been talking about. And engaging with that is really important.
There are some very good papers on this, on kind of techno-demonism, and there was one a few years ago very much about that very question of using principalities and demonologies as a way of talking about technologies as agencies in the world. So yes, there are some very good papers out there doing that kind of work.
Rupert, then Tristan.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Really interesting stuff. I'm not sure I'm convinced, though. Let's focus in on the example of the corporation. So if we consider Joel Bachan's analysis of the corporation, corporations are psychopathic monsters that we've unleashed, and they're now very difficult to bring back in control. But of course, Bachan argues that we can bring them back into control. It is possible. It would require a serious amount of political will. It would require doing things like revoking corporate charters, such that the corporations then cease to exist. Now, if you can tame a monster by making it cease to exist, by revoking its charter, well, it's a bit different from the kind of monsters that we're used to thinking of, I think. And I guess I'm worried that your picture might be disempowering. Let's take one other example of why the public limited liability corporation is not necessarily an uncontrollable monster. And here I'm disagreeing with Bachan. Bachan says they have to maximize profit, and that dictates their behavior. But actually that's very unclear, because what it is to maximize profit is always up for negotiation. So intelligent managements, for example, can say, I'm maximizing long-term shareholder value by pursuing strategies which will, for example, involve the climate not being destroyed, or by getting our customers to like us by convincing them that we're actually not monstrous. And the best way to convince people that you're not monstrous in the end is actually not to be monstrous, rather than simply to employ clever PR people, which sooner or later gives out as a stratagem. So it seems to me that there's two ways there, one Bachanian and one anti-Bachanian, in which we can query the claim that corporations are out of control monsters. So I do wonder whether that might be a disempowering effect of your terminological proposal.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll try and answer both questions. The first one, and the book and the film, The Corporation, yeah, there's this very good question about how can you fight these corporations, and yes, some countries have laws where they can be taken apart, and in the film there's this interesting case of, I think it's California tries to actually do this to one of the corporations, and I think they fail. But I think I think legally there are ways of fighting these monsters, taming them. But they're monsters. They're monsters nonetheless. That's the reason for being motivated to fight them. They are externalizing machines which are creating all kinds of environmental problems and driving global warming, So there are clear cases when they do need to be fought, and there are ways in which they can be tamed. It's often a case that if you bring other monsters to fight monsters, you kind of bring the legal system, the institution of, the legal framework to bear upon some of these monsters. So it's how we can mobilise different monsters. It's like Godzilla versus Mothra. You bring different monsters to fight some of the other monsters. The other question is one about, are corporations only about maximising profit? And my students often raise this question. They say, oh yes, you can look at very, corporations with good practices, very ecologically sound. I think this is where you just need you need a typology, or what I was called at a talk a couple of weeks ago. I said you need kind of a bestiary of these different corporations. I think some which start to move away from the profit motive kind of become something else. I think they're still monstrous, they're still agencies, but they become close to something else. Whereas I think the corporation, I might, have different types of corporation, but I think they're still externalizing machines. So I think you need kind of a bestiary or a typology of different kinds of creatures which are out there.
But my claim is that the profit motive...
Look, Rupert, you're not on the microphone. We're going to have to terminate quickly. We've got time for one more question from Tristan.
Okay. Quick question. We were just discussing this outside the tent, actually. We're discussing Thackeray's In the Dust of Our Planet. And he talks about this. And, so his argument, or one of the arguments, is about what this monster represents. And it represents existentialism, that the planet, there's no meaning, we have no meaning. And the scary part of this monster is precisely that you can't reason with it. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about anything. It doesn't even care about its own self-interest. Right? And so the analogy here between the monster and, say, a corporation, I'm struggling to link those two things, in the sense that the corporation is self-interested, it does have interests, and it can be reasoned with. The monster, however, cannot. Did I explain that correctly, or do you think
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you have to. It's how you look at these different entities. What things exist in the world, and I think you have to kind of do the kind of conceptual work to say, are these things with an agency? And I don't think everything has an agency. I don't think all systems necessarily have an agency. Manuel de Landa's very good on this. He has a very recent book called On Assemblage Theory. And he works through certain things which do and don't. He doesn't think capitalism does, but he thinks markets have got an agency, but capitalism doesn't. So I think you have to kind of do the work. And you can kind of work out what kind of drives the different things in the world, and I think most you can affect. There's affect theory. You can affect a corporation through the profit motive, through laws, etc., and different entities you affect in different ways. So something like Gaia's been affected. I think you could, if you want to talk about Gaia as an assemblage or a system or a holistic whole, there are ways in which that is being affected. But I think you need to look at it on a case-by-case scenario. But I think all things that can be affected have their own logic, or I don't know what code. They follow their own codes, their own imperatives. But I think we're not very good at actually working out what those are. You need kind of a different kind of a morphology or a way of working this out.
We do have to move on.
That's fine.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Glad now to introduce Shailen Popat.
Thank you very much. Before I begin my talk, I'd just like to take a minute to thank people. So Simon and team, thank you very much for organising today, my first time here. What a wonderful centre. So great to know that we have centres like this, hidden away. And I think one of the results of today is that we can all promote these places, and I enjoyed having a brief walk around the museum and so on, and I got a better understanding of what you do. So thank you very much to all of you for that. Thank you for also putting it on YouTube and having videos afterwards. That is very, very important for people who can't be here and for us to all revisit and promote afterwards as well. Secondly, can I thank all the speakers that I've heard so far for stimulating so much interesting thought and discussion. And I won't take up too much time on each of them, but just I want to say a couple. With Rupert, he's left the room, I think, but I did speak with him at lunchtime because I was saying to him that as a PhD student, it's actually very important for us to have seasoned academics publish controversial things. Because if we want to follow in those footsteps, we do require people to publish in different ways so that we can then follow that or refer to that. Because for an early career researcher to do it is much more difficult, and for a research student could be nearly impossible. And David, it would be a great, well, you said you're going to retire, but I hope that doesn't mean that your thoughts and your production will be removed from the world. Otherwise, we may regard your retirement as also a contributory factor to climate change. Thank you very much for that. I attended a climate and apocalypse conference at the University of Warwick 2 years ago, where I was based then. And what came across to me, I was a member of the audience in that conference. It was an all-day conference as well. And there was no real thought from the East in that whole day. And so I resolved that day that the next time I got an opportunity, I would provide that voice. And so the aim of my talk today is to do that. I'm very pleased that members of the Hindu community of the Brahma Kumari tradition have accepted my invitation to come today. My mother had joined that very interesting group that looks very critically at Hinduism. So it's not something that, it's a group that doesn't accept anything per se. It chooses to question it very academically and systematically. So I actually spent a lot of my childhood in gatherings like this. And I think it did help my cognitive development growing up. So I'm really pleased that Rosemary brought me over from Oxford, Rachel has come from London, Sylvia, Carol have come from Leicester, that you have been able to come today. Because I do think providing that Eastern thought into this wider discussion and networking is very important. So I'm going to say that together with interdisciplinary work, I would say that interfaith perspectives of this topic are very important. So now let me move on to the actual talk. I would like to talk about the Hindu cycle of time and look at these 4 areas of thoughts around the apocalypse, of potentiality, actuality, the apocalypse as being hostile to the status quo, and the apocalypse and fatality. So if I begin firstly just by referring to the image in front of you, which is going to be on every slide, so you cannot miss it. But this is the depiction of the Hindu concept of time. And I wanted to bring in, you'll see the red in that picture as the swastika image, which you may be familiar with. And this is going to be my attempt to claim it back from the corruption of the Nazis and really present it to you in a way that it is used in India and in Indian homes, which is a very positive symbol. It's usually drawn in red, as that's regarded as an auspicious color, sometimes green, sometimes slightly a variation of that. And if you look at it in this context of the cycle of being of 4 ages, a golden age, a silver, a copper, and an iron. The Sanskrit terminology is Satya Yuga, which is literally an age of truth. Treta Yuga, which is an age of honor. Dwapara Yuga, which is an age of duality. And what Hindus would regard the current age as Kali Yuga, which is the age of division and calamity. And then that whole cycle repeats round again. So Kali Yuga moves into Satya Yuga. And certainly in some traditions, the current phase that we're going through is regarded as the confluence, the meeting of these cycles. So Kali Yuga meeting Satya Yuga. And so within that context lies this concept of the apocalypse. So I wish to share on that theme. What I'm finding is that the term apocalypse, it's so grounded within Greek concepts and Judeo-Christian conversation that it's viewed and written about mainly with that backdrop and with those lenses. However, if apocalypse is viewed with a different lens of time, we heard a talk earlier about the temporal aspect and how the temporal aspect frames a lot of perception. So then the perception of the apocalypse changes if the perception of time changes with it. Instead of time being a linear concept, if it is perceived as a circular concept, then the apocalypse is not something just of the future, but it is something that has happened and is something that will reoccur. And this is the main argument that I'm making. If one is to understand Hindu philosophy, I would say to you that the key word is eternity. Whether one looks at the concept of the soul, the Atman, the concept of God, the Paramatma, the concept of the elements of nature, the Panch Tattva, the concept is one that nothing is ever really created and nothing is ever really destroyed. You just get transformations of energy. And it's the transformation of energy that occurs over time that this cycle refers to. So I'm going to explore 4 concepts within this talk. Concept number 1, that the present is always pre-apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. Concept number 2, fatality is not finality, as there is no finality. Concept number 3, human existence is a dramatic tragedy in the Greek sense. And a lot of my talk is going to be on that. And concept number 4, as you're familiar with and previous speakers have referred to it, that the apocalypse in this framework is a purification system. So the main points, potentiality. So the apocalypse is something which is potential, something of the future. And then, of course, a lot of the criticisms in the literature about potentiality is then you've got narratives of actuality, so the post-apocalyptic films and other depictions. So something that has already occurred, or something that will occur. And really, in this framing, it's both. It's always potential, and it's always actual. It's always a hostility to the status quo, because in this concept of time, if one puts time as central, as a central driver for life, then the status quo is always changing anyway. And so that status quo that is being challenged is always being challenged. But the apocalypse that the status quo is challenging is that status quo is always changing. So perceptions of the apocalypse also change with that. Because one is trying to move away from a different status quo. depending on where one is in history. And then one of the emotional reactions, of course, with the apocalypse is that apocalypse means fatality. When one frames it within eternity, there's no such thing as fatality. And so the apocalypse is not seen as such an enemy, although it has a certain amount of fatality of some aspects, but not comprehensive fatality. Concept number one. The present is always pre-apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. The process of destruction is never finalized. And this answers some of those that doubt in Apocalypse with regards to the existence of survivors who report then the apocalyptic ordeal. So this solves that question, or perhaps ventures to solve that question. If one poses the question, I wonder what a post-apocalyptic world would look like. From the framing of this cycle, it would involve a marquee, a PowerPoint, lunch. So what I'm presenting to you is that congratulations. You're all post-apocalyptic survivors. So the post-apocalyptic world is not something which is not known, but something that is being lived and is known, and something that has been known. Because the whole series of the cycle is one which is going towards an apocalypse and then emerging from an apocalypse afterwards. In that sense, it's actually a narrative of hope, and it's also a narrative of promise, but it's also a narrative of continuity. Concepts of past and present alter considerably with this framework. Secondly, fatality is not finality, as there is no finality. And this is a quote from Mazurek, some of you may be familiar with. Only one thing is certain. It is the powerful and disruptive might which will change things on an unprecedented scale. To put things crudely, we do not know what is going to happen, but we do know that it will be devastating, irreversible, and last but definitely not least, unavoidable. As such, apocalypse constitutes the negative cultural project par excellence. Capable of disrupting everything, it offers nothing except the certainty of its own disruptive might. So the apocalypse, in the framing of the cycle, is this disruptive act, but it's also a catalyzing act. Because to shift radically from one age, one way of thinking and being and doing, to a completely different age and a completely different way of thinking and seeing and doing and being, requires such a disruptive energy. And so the apocalypse is something which is necessary in this process of time revolving. So it's not something that is final, but something that is catalyzing. This concept of this process of time and of human existence as a dramatic tragedy. In the Poetics, Aristotle explains that the plot in a tragedy is more than just the story itself. It is the arrangement of the incidents or chain reaction of cause and effect events that happen in the story. So this cycle of time is not a random thing. It is seen as a causal chain, with the past creating the present creating the future, and then microcosms of that, where every thought then leads into the next, every word leads into the next, every action continually leading into the next. Aristotle also believed that the plot must have unity of action. So not only does each causal chain have its own connection, but that all causal chains within this bigger concept of time must have unity of action, where all of the events are dependent on the previous and lead to the next. We start with the incentive moment, or the moment that begins the cause and effect chain of events. Now, in a circle, the point of creation is always contested, it's always debated. So one could argue that the apocalypse is the moment of creation. One could use the lens that the book of Revelation meets the book of Genesis in that sense. Well, I read that upstairs. So this type of thing. One could argue these things. The reversal, sometimes called peripecia, is a reversal of circumstances for the worse. And some of you may be familiar with Professor Sharot's excellent work of how our brain is geared towards being optimistic. And Matt Ridley, the Times columnist, he's written a book in 2012 called The Rational Optimist. And what Professor Sharot talks about is, and she's got a very excellent TED talk that you might want to visit if you haven't, is that we always think we're going to be okay, we'll get married, it'll be great, and our children will be geniuses, and we have this predisposition to optimism. And then we actually end up dealing with tragedies, because the reality can be quite different. And so policy, if we look at policy making throughout the ages, it's going to be great. And then the unintended consequences that come from that. And so this is why this human narrative of the tragedy. And then the climax, of course, is that highest point of action. So I'm arguing that this apocalyptic lens is really, what we're talking about, is a climax of action. However, does something happen after a climax? Well, recognition. Recognition is when the character makes an important discovery and gains insight into his life. The catastrophe marks the hero's ultimate suffering, which sometimes includes his own death. The resolution only comes when the other characters can mourn the loss of the hero, but then sees the good that has come with his passing. So rather than the fatalism of the apocalypse, it's actually something which is used to then build the next. Even though the hero suffers, in the end, he learns something about himself and his place in the world. Unfortunately, he sometimes dies after the discovery, and the play ends. And I've put in brackets, and begins again. And concept 4. And this is a quote from Berger. From the Book of Revelation's condemnation of Babylon through the millenarian movements of the Middle Ages to more recent apocalyptic thinking, both religious and secular, visions of the end and its aftermath emphasize that no social reform can cure the world's diseases. Every structure of the old world is infected, and only an absolute purifying cataclysm can make possible an utterly new, perfected world. And so that very much fits within this narrative of shifting of ages. That when ages meet each other, and indeed when cycles meet each other, there is going to be this cataclysmic event. However, there is also then the narrative of the need to think about what happens after, because there is always an after. And perhaps that rescues the lifeboat metaphor that Rupert mentioned earlier, that actually there does need to be a lifeboat, because there will always be an after. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailen. Rupert, question.
Hi, Rupert.
Hi. Yeah. Look, I'm totally in favour of us taking seriously Eastern thought, and I think that that's one of the things that gives us some hope at this point in history. But I do worry slightly that the way you're presenting it to us may give us a false sense of security. So here's a couple of key quotes from your talk. The process of destruction is never finalized. There is no finality. But it's not clear that we can be confident of that anymore. We need to consider things like Hansen's Venusian scenario as a possible way that climate change could manifest. And the Venusian scenario, if it occurs, would mean the end of life on Earth. That would be it. I mean, if that isn't a finality, then what is? I mean, you could say, look, it could be even worse. We could destroy the whole universe. But I don't feel a huge sense of relief that if we only manage to completely exterminate life on Earth. And so I'd feed back to you this remark of Wittgenstein's, which I think is very profound. He said, the truly apocalyptic view of history is that things do not repeat themselves. And I think we have to face that as a possibility.
Yeah, I think this is why it's so important to have this cultural exchange of ideas. Because, as I said, I do see this as a narrative of hope. So like some of the other speakers have said before, and I think people questioned you on this as well, that there is a positive narrative to things that are happening. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything that is leading to climate change and perhaps a climate change apocalypse is negative, because a lot of the science, say, for example, I think you were saying that there's no such thing as, clean economic growth. Now, there is a reading of what you said, which is saying we shouldn't bother with developing clean technologies or developing technologies that can be good for after. And I suppose what this narrative says is that actually the challenges of climate change are also inspiring some really good inventions. And those good inventions need to make it aboard the lifeboat. And I think that's where this narrative is powerful.
Richard? Hi, thank you for that. I found that really interesting. One of the things, because I suppose what you've presented here, because it's so elegant in its presentation of the design here of cyclicity, one of the things I was wondering about, and this follows on from what you're saying, that this is about dialogue, is how that kind of model might be dissonant with other kinds of model which it coexists with. I'm thinking in particular of the anthropologist Virtung's work in Sri Lanka, where he talks about the ways in which there were clashes between those who were advocating particular environmental reforms in Sri Lanka, and those who said, well, this is Kaliunga, this is to be expected, and then that becomes a way of resisting those kinds of changes. So, I mean, given what you're saying, that you want to enter this into a dialogue, what kinds of dissonances do you find interesting, I suppose, between this model of rebirth and other ways of thinking about time?
Indeed. It's such an important question, because what I wanted to emphasize was the need for interdisciplinarity and interfaith, because what those multiple disciplines do, they bring the critical thinking. Hence my mention at the beginning of the Brahma-Kumari movement, and why I like it is it's a critical thought towards Hinduism. It's a critical perspective. So this model is not meant to be accepted, it's meant to be thought about. I'm in favor of a train of thought along the lines of, say, applied Hinduism. And when one is beginning to use philosophy and trying to apply it in any context, it takes that broader conversation that you are speaking of. One can take any concept and believe it blindly. But then when we begin to ask ourselves, does this really work? Is this really of benefit? And it's in that challenging of each other. It's in that questioning of each other that I would be hopeful we would actually find the real nectar of these concepts. What I wish to bring today is really that if the climate discourse is dominated by North America and Europe, which are steeped within Judeo-Christian traditions, then most of the world is not. So I've forgotten which speaker posed this problem about communication. It might have been the last speaker. This issue of communicating the climate change narrative. Is it because we've not actually listened to that multiplicity of beliefs? So if someone is saying that they're a fatalist, whatever's going to happen, to happen, do we need to actually listen to why they're saying that? What are the thought processes? And then learn a new way of communicating so that perhaps they begin to adopt a new way of thinking.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and particularly helpful to think of apocalyptic thinking in terms of a cyclical worldview, so it's very helpful. I just got a very minor sort of observation, whilst I'm sure it's important to talk about East and West and Judeo-Christian and such like. Obviously the kind of cyclical apocalyptic thinking is something very much in Western culture too, so in the kind of Stoic thought, this idea of ekpyrosis and this regular conflagration leading to purification and rebirth of the universe is something that's there too. So whilst I totally appreciate the language about interfaith and whatever dialogue, in a way, I always think these things it's very important sometimes to be a bit more kind of trans-historical as well, and perhaps to give voice to traditions that may not be living traditions today, but may have something to contribute, and sometimes a part of the environment within which major contemporary world traditions were born, because that idea of cyclical rebirth is certainly a dialogue partner in some New Testament texts as it shapes its own apocalyptic thinking. So.
Yes, precisely. And I would say that because I spoke about this, it enabled you to say that just now. And I think this is the point. I'm wanting to use quite stark language, because it then allows people to say, well, actually, we've got this way of thinking as well. But the dominant discourse does not involve what you've just said.
No, absolutely. I totally agree.
And it's that dominant discourse that I wish to try and challenge. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Earl, is the Katerina there?
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I realize that this is not exactly your topic, but maybe you could speak to it. Do you see anything going on in India that people, movements that pick up on this and provide us with models, actually sort of maybe in a more applied fashion that could be useful in the Western world? It's like, this morning we talked about sort of the Anglo-Protestant tradition. There's probably a particularly high rate of climate skepticism. Right. Is there something sort of concrete in India that could give us some hope? Because quite frankly, I'm looking for hope here.
Yes, great. So now I don't know enough about this, but why I was so pleased that these guests have come. Rachel was telling me, so they've actually got an NGO which works with the UN, and they have environmental programs. So Sylvia and Rachel, I think they're trying to bridge in the way that you're describing. So may I ask you to speak with them at the tea break, as they will know. Would you raise your hands? Yeah, Sylvia. Would that be okay? I just don't know enough about that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, you've got somebody else? Yep, one more.
Thanks very much, Shailen. Is this on? Doesn't seem as if. Okay, that's good. Very interested in learning about Eastern traditions and enriching our discourses. But my question is one that's generally about the links between discourse and practice, and it's really following, I think, what's been said here. In the Western Christian tradition, there's been a long talk about environmental stewardship, but it hasn't really made much difference to people's behaviours. And I've read that, for example, in certain Eastern religions, Buddhism, for example, with a more ameliorative attitude towards nature, it hasn't really made that much of a difference to actual practices. Have you got some examples of how practices have been changed through this discourse?
No, I think what you're describing is that we've gone into a global consciousness of acquisition. And because of that, I very much enjoyed Rupert's reference to enoughism. Now, and another speaker I think was speaking about you've got examples of religious orders who will profess simplicity and so on. So what you get is certain peoples who observe a maybe more sustainable life. But perhaps that's always been the case. What this model provides is perhaps a framework as to why the dominant discourse doesn't do that, because it's a tragedy. It's always working its way towards an apocalypse. So it's not that the thought isn't there and the ideas are not there, but the dominance of the trajectory of this world always takes us towards this apocalyptic event, no matter how much we don't want it to be like that. So I would say that it's the discourse we need to encourage is this one of enoughism. I think some reaction towards the dominant discourse is the exploration of spirituality that many people have. And what they will be looking for is qualities of contentment. Oh, I feel peaceful. I feel content. And when they're saying that, what they're implying is that the way in which I've been living my life didn't provide that contentment or didn't provide that peace. I thought if I had 3 cars that went very quickly, I would be content. But it was never enough. And I think this is the crucial thing. So you go back to the spiritual thinking, which is ageless and timeless. But the actual practicality of it will require the broader discourse as we, as humanity, how much is enough for me?
Shailen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Just while he's putting his mic on, Earl's been with us. Earl lives here now. He's been here for the last few days. He actually introduced our two film nights over the last couple of days, and I always wanted to take the opportunity to thank him for all his technical help today. I couldn't have done it without him. So thank you so much, Earl. And Earl is now also going to present his paper. So when you're ready. Half an hour behind, so it's still the same schedule, just add on half an hour if you're looking in your programs, okay?
Okay, thank you. So, as Simon introduced me, I'm Earl. I'm a doctoral researcher at the end of my second year at the University of Bristol. Some of the theories that I will be using, I'm only just wrestling with, so please do forgive me. If any of you have read Lacan, I apologise, there is going to be some Lacanian psychoanalysis in this. So a bit of the context behind the project that I want to talk to you about today. Climate change is increasingly being framed as an urban problem. We're seeing that both in the academic literature from people like Harriet Bulkeley and Marina Kaika, but we're also seeing it in the public domain with things like the Paris Treaty, where Donald Trump left the Paris Treaty, but US cities are signing up in their dozens. So we're seeing climate change being more and more increasingly seen as an urban challenge. I've also put urban in shutter quotes there because, of course, it is a problematic term. I'm taking it to mean the processes and objects associated with cities. So it's a very broad definition of urban. Coupled with this, there's a rise in large-scale urban redevelopment projects and regeneration projects. You can see this particularly in cities such as London, where there's an enormous boom in large projects which contain both commercial and residential applications. In the past, these have been kind of explained through gentrification processes. Sarah Dooling adds to this the idea of ecological gentrification. So in the past, it was just rebuilding houses to house more wealthy people, more desirable people, according to the government or according to the private interests at hand. Now it's doing that, but in the name of solving climate change. So that's what I want to talk about in particular. There's also a development of a post-political political ecology. A lot of the instances of the word political in there, but basically what I'm talking about is political ecology being the politics of ecology, and that politics has become post-political. And I'll explain more about what that means in a second. Through a lot of social science as well, there's an increasing recognition of the dominance of the visual. A lot more visual methods are being employed. Personally, I'm going to be using visual semiotics in my PhD, so I will be using visual methodologies and visual theories that go with it as well. Also, for those of you who know Rancière's work on La Politique, I'd like to contribute to a more nuanced understanding of that, which also comes from Rancière, Zizek, and Swingerdale. Post-politics, which is a techno-managerialism within a framework which cannot be contested. So the idea is that we no longer question whether something should be done, we question how it should be done, such as capitalism. Whether we should have capitalism is now how do we actually manage capitalism. Archaepolitics, which is an undivided community. There is no dissent within your community. This is kind of a utopian and some would argue impossible vision to achieve. Metapolitics, where you have an organic whole, on the surface at least. Parapolitics, which is where you actually have a displacement of political agendas onto non-political things. Whether there is such thing as non-political, I'm not sure. And then there's ultrapolitics, which is a friend-enemy distinction, brought around by Carl Schmitt actually in the 30s, a controversial scholar at least, but then further emphasised by Zizek more recently. So I have to say it says continued here because I've hidden one of the slides for time. So the theory that I'm going to be using is commodity theory. Of course, Karl Marx factors into this quite heavily, but in particular asking the question, how do futures become commodified in these projects? So these aren't just selling a present project, they're also selling a future, and that's what I want to ask. With La Politique, how does the political factor into the Lacanian symbolic and imaginary orders? So these are the two levels that our brain functions at, trying to explain things that we can't explain. So the symbolic is language, and then everything left over is the real, and the imaginary is how we explain the difference between those two. Psychoanalysis, I'm going to go back to Freud, probably a little controversially and outdatedly, but I do believe it has relevance here. If we go to Freud's baby, the idea is that the baby is completely defenseless. So she seeks out help from others to fulfill her wishes and desires, such as food or play or sleep or defense against wild animals. And that's where we get the origin of our sociality. It's from our defenselessness that we actually become social. And then spectacle, coming from Guy Debord's theories in the 60s, what does the visual actually do to mediate these social and capitalist relationships within these projects? And finally, of course, where does the apocalypse actually factor into this? With the analysis, I'm going to do a visual data analysis, so there's a lot of photographs that I'm going to show you. But the things that I want to look out for in my analysis are things such as elements of the urban which do not look urban. This sounds like a strange concept, but things like green walls, which you may just be able to see in the background image here, there's a better image of that later on. Things which are urban, you can only have a green wall in an urban environment, but it isn't urban because it's part of nature, or what we can typically conceive as nature. Logonomic systems, which again is a semiotic term, for systems that are employed to try and appellate or create certain audiences for the messages that you're trying to produce. And then temporary permanence or permanent temporariness, not just an academic exercise in producing nice-sounding words. This is where I'm looking for objects in the urban environment where actually they look temporary but are permanent, or things that look permanent but are temporary. And these should give us a sense of whether the urban is constantly transforming or whether it is actually there, and what part of that is fantasy as well. Again, senses of community. What is the community that is trying to be created through this project? And also this idea of collective wish fulfillment through the community fulfilling wishes of itself. So the data that I want to talk about was collected in Elephant and Castle in South London in 2015 and 2016. The images are all my own. They were taken on my phone camera, so please forgive the low quality of some of them on a screen this size. Most of the images are of the hoardings, the building hoardings around the sites, mainly because those are where the future of the project is actually communicated to the public. So this is what you would typically consider Elephant and Castle. It's a 1960s shopping centre with a tower block built on top of it, quite dilapidated. Underneath there is also the tube station, the terminus of the Bakerloo line, and you have a lot of multicultural food producers either at street level or in restaurants around the area. Again, this is the sort of housing that you're looking at. This is a wonderful example of 1960s town planning where you have two-storey houses stacked one on top of another. And this is one of the old buildings. And you can just see in the corner here, this building here, which is the first one to be completed and occupied by residents. This is, as far as I'm aware, the only building in the UK that has wind turbines built into its infrastructure, but it faces in the wrong direction, so they don't actually spin. So the idea is that in this tower up here, which you can see from all across London, you can see these big turbines. We are a green project, and so on and so forth. The entire thing is developed by one massive capitalist developer, Lend-Lease. This is their show flat and marketing suites that they can show you around the flats. You can see again lots of green. These trees apparently are in bags. I'm not quite sure why. We've got a child running with a kite. The only bit that isn't green is the kite. So there's images there of contrast of air and greenery and all this sort of stuff. These are the hoardings that we start to see. Healthier living is right next to the offices. We also have a meter up here for displaying the amount of CO2 that's been saved by the solar panels that are on the on-site office roofs. And a lot of it is focused around improving air quality, not necessarily climate change, but air quality. And as we see throughout the projects, this doesn't really mean much. The sense of community is being created through these hoardings again by saying, be a part of it. Part of what is unclear at this stage because it's still just a construction site. And again, these slogans show up all over the place, the life, the heart, the elephant. The images, though, are quite interesting. You may not be able to see very clearly there, but this is the project with one of the new green parks that they're creating. But nowhere in the background is London to be seen. So we're creating a community within London that is part of London, yet not part of London, I think is the kind of message they're trying to give here. This is one of the tower blocks under construction when I visited in 2015. Later you'll see it was clad, not as flammably as Grenfell, luckily, but it was clad in solid gold, pretty much. It looks golden, at least. Went back in 2016. The local shopping centre hasn't changed much. You can see the sorts of shops that they're advertising on. These shops, probably you can imagine the sort of clientele that they would take and the sort of clientele that the business, that the new housing will take. And one can probably imagine that they're not the same people. So the shopping centre hasn't actually evolved with the new residential projects that are going up around the area. We also have this project, which is part of the temporary permanent temporariness, which is the Artworks Elephant, originally built to house the Southwark Library whilst they redeveloped the building, but they decided to put a series of shipping containers around the bottom and house kind of bohemian businesses and startup enterprises in those areas. It's quite a phantasmagoric space. It's quite kind of fantasy land. There's lots of lights and lovely colours and smells. There's lots of multi-ethnic food in here. But again, it's restaurants rather than street food. It's not quite the same feel to it. You can see the sorts of businesses that are there, but also the fact that all of this is written in chalk. So the businesses are not intended to be there for very long at all. The idea is, I think, that this is an incubator to create mobility within the community. But again, I'm not sure whether the people who were originally in the community would have started this sort of business. It's a question that needs to be asked. To give you a sense of the scale of the project, this is the tower with the wind turbines in the top. However, the tower cranes that were functioning almost constantly When I went there, I counted 9 on the skyline that were constantly operating. You can actually see that there's 2 here. It looks like there's 1, but there's actually 2 there. The scale of the project is absolutely phenomenal. So it's a really big enterprise project. And as people are moving into one phase, they're still breaking ground on other phases around the project. So you're living in a construction site for a number of years. This is the kind of narrative that I believe is quite telling of what the project is trying to do. Creating London's new green heart. Now, per capita, London is actually quite green, or quite environmentally friendly. So creating a new green heart, the idea is to create a new centre of the city, to pull people south of the river, away from London as we know it, north of the river, into Southwark. It's also, again, trying to create this heart, the idea of this will be the centre of everything. You can live, work, eat, sleep, whatever you want to do, right here in this space. Again, you can see the tower blocks in the artistic renderings. There's a very small bit of London in the background here, so again, part of London, but not part of London. This again is an artistic rendering on one of the billboards. There'll be allotment gardens on the rooftops, in contrast to the smog, dirt, and horror of London in the background. Again, also the care that was taken over these. This spade appears to be floating, I'm not quite sure why. And this woman is quietly sat reading her book, so there's an individualization as well as a communitarian spirit on the background over there. The number of people employed on the site, probably numbers in the thousands, judging by what I saw. So around probably at most half of the people employed are from the local area, yet they're proudly displaying this figure on their billboards. This one is particularly important because it shows, again, one of the green park spaces completely enclosed by the new buildings. This is particularly important for what I'll go on to in the analysis section, so I want you to bear that image in mind. You can see, again, the 3 phases of urban development. You've got the Victorian architecture here, 60s town planning, and then the brand new stuff right in the background. As you look around, you see these pockets of Victorian and 60s architecture being kind of surrounded and colonised, almost intimidated by the new tower blocks that are going up. So it's almost like a colonisation of the area. People are really moving into another area and almost pushing people out just by their presence of being in the area. This is the tower I was talking about. This cladding, I think, is probably a high space age technology. I'm not sure what material that will be, but it is literally gold. It looks like it's gold. It oozes wealth and kind of a symbol of status in the London skyline. There's the new leisure centre and council offices while they renovate the old council offices. Again, you can imagine in an economically deprived area, previously full of council properties and low-income families, this again doesn't look like somewhere that you would be welcome to go into, especially considering it's in the middle of all the brand new residential developments. Again, we have the green walls, this time hiding a car park. So you've got the ostensible, green spaces within the city, but can you actually enjoy a green wall in the same way as you can enjoy a green park? My argument would be no, it's purely aesthetic. It does serve a purpose of filtration, but I'm not sure whether that's the main objective. It's just to look like there's something going on. Again, some form of urban nature. This poor corgi, I went there around 10 a.m. in the morning, so the owner had obviously gone out to work, left the corgi on the balcony to bark at passers-by, with just the box for shelter at the far end. So you can see, just from this short cross-section of certain balconies, that there isn't much bringing nature inside of the properties. It's very much about the external nature of the property. You can see here as well the old 60s building is getting a facelift. Probably not being renovated internally. I don't know, but I would imagine this is just an external work so that, again, the wealthier population don't have to look at something that's a bit ugly, as is the case in so many other projects. And we have the green wall here. Again, we have small amounts of green here, and then inside we have a massive amount of green, a whole tree, and a chandelier, an outdoor chandelier. So you can see who the nature is to benefit in a way. It's to benefit the people who live in the project and have access. Inside here is the concierge, where there were 2 concierge and then about 3 or 4 security guards in a very small space. So it's very much a securitized space with only permission to access for certain people. If you turn the camera slightly, though, you get this row of trees, and then you look back into the 60s developments across the road. Now, this is partly because this is a major bus interchange. For those of you who know Elephant and Castle, you'll be aware of that. But also, this creates the idea of really starkly putting into contrast the urban inequalities that are created by the project. Again, we have the 60s tower block here, and then new ones behind it trying to kind of impinge and overshadow that space, quite literally as well as figuratively. So the themes that come out of the data for me are, this is the bit that I hate in the presentation, the word that I have to pronounce, immunological biopolitical fantasy. This is a concept propounded by a number of theorists, most notably Eric Swinnerdow at the moment, about the idea is that when you buy into the fantasy, when you buy one of these projects, you're buying into the idea that you're immunized against the apocalypse. The idea being that these projects protect you, they create a nice bubble for you to live inside of, and because of that, you have various other factors at play as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. Also, the signifiers in the urban arena appear to be that if we have an urban control of nature through green walls and trees growing inside courtyards, does that equal a global control of nature? Is climate change no longer a problem? Because all around you, you can see that we have dominated nature. We have green walls, we have vertical gardens, we have trees and chandeliers. So if all that is possible, then surely climate change can no longer be a problem. So this is part of the immunological biopolitical fantasy. In the project, I believe there's a simultaneous necessity and impossibility of community as well. By that, what I mean is that the project has to create a sense of community. It has to create a collective sense of desires and wishes and a collective sense of belonging. However, when you do that, there's a chance that these people may well get together and realize that they're all different to one another. A wonderful thing in a multicultural society, but when you're trying to extract higher rent values, you want everyone to believe that they are the ones saving the world, rather than they are in a hodgepodge of a mixture of people. So you have a necessity and an impossibility of community in this project, in my opinion, at least. Now, I'm quite happy for you to argue with me at the end. This also has a reproduction of urban inequalities, but I believe this is necessarily created by the immunological biopolitics. The reason for that is because for you to have an inside of your bubble, you also have to have an outside. So by creating this immunological biopolitical fantasy, you have to create a dystopia outside for you to gaze upon so you can feel better about the biopolitical fantasy that you're living in. What's of the real, symbolic and imaginary? Well, in my opinion, the symbolic is quite simple. This is a big project, you pay money, you get immunized against the coming apocalypse. The imaginary is that by protecting myself, I'm somehow saving others. So by protecting myself in my fantasy world of the building project, I am actually creating a better world for those outside of it, even though we know this is not true. And that is where the real comes in. Climate change is such a complicated and chaotic thing that actually we don't want to confront it head on. We'd rather live inside the fantasy that enables us to reconcile those differences, which creates economies of enjoyment. So we have to get rid of that excess enjoyment somehow, and we do that through things such as the artworks Elephant, where we can go and live in this fantasy world where we are collectively fulfilling our wishes in the defenselessness of climate change by seeking a sociality with those who are also doing the same thing. So I believe in this case we are seeing a form of apocalyptic urbanism, but not the form where we're trying to create an apocalypse, but a form where we're trying to avoid one. So the conclusions that can be made are quite simple based on the themes that arise from the project. So we have an immunological biopolitics. We are immunizing ourselves against the apocalypse. We have an evacuation of the political moment from the Lacanian symbolic order, which is the definition of post-political. The idea of dissent never enters these people's mind because they are doing everything that they can do. They already think they are dissenting by buying into these projects. Collective wish fulfillment is done through the economies of enjoyment. People are seeking out others who are also defenseless and therefore living in a community of defenselessness. We do have ecological gentrification in this case, I believe, because the project is selling itself solely on the idea of green living and a new green heart for London, yet it is pushing people out and is trying to colonise the space and socially engineer. So the question that I want to leave you with, and the question that was the title of my talk, is which apocalypse do we actually want? In avoiding an apocalypse of nature, I believe, and I would argue, that we're actually creating an apocalypse of character. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Earl. Questions for Earl? Richard.
Hi, thanks very much for that. So, in terms of the analysis you presented of the way that this development is portrayed and, in effect, the marketing of the image of this, I thought that was really revealing what you were saying. I guess my question is, to what extent do you think that there is a buy-in to this image? So in a sense, I understand what you're saying about the aesthetic spectacle that's being created here, but what I wondered about is, to what extent do you think that there's a certain amount of cynicism on the part of those who are presenting this kind of image? I mean, especially when you've got the fiasco of turbines pointing the wrong way. And also, I wondered about the way that you were reading the motives of the people who are then moving into these properties, into this. Because I was thinking, well, do they, when they're looking at these images, looking at these kinds of presentations that we're seeing right now, are they really envisaging themselves as being part of this kind of political project, or in fact is that only a very superficial buy-in? Are there other motives at play? So that's what I was wondering. Cheers.
No, thank you. I think that's a really important point, because with semiotics, there's the three sites of meaning production, of course. There's the people who are producing the images or producing the spectacle itself, and the audience it's intended for. So whether you are producing meaning at one of those levels or the other, you're producing meaning at all levels. My interest is with the audience side, because I think that's where we have most impact. And regardless of what meaning you intend to produce, quite often you don't produce that meaning in your audience. So, my belief is that by looking at the images, you can discern a certain thing about who they're trying to create as an audience for their projects. I also would say that there isn't a genuine, honest buy-in to these things, because green is all around us at the moment. Green is one of the biggest concepts in marketing that we have at the moment. And I think that one of the key points with that is that I spent around 3 months trying to search for the meaning of green and couldn't find it. It's a completely empty signifier in terms of what it actually means applied to ecology. So I think that the reason it's become so empty is people want to buy into it, but they don't want to really deal with the intricacies of what it means. So my belief is, and the analysis seems to be bearing it out, I could be wrong, my belief and my kind of gut feeling is that people are buying into this idea of, oh, and we can live a more sustainable lifestyle, but that's as far as it goes. It's just a skin-deep kind of touching upon, well, the project says it's sustainable, so we can stop caring now. We can just live our lives. So I think that for some people, they'll be seeking out specifically, certain indicators of environmental performance. And I think for those people, they wouldn't end up living in these projects because they look into it and say, oh, well, it meets the minimum standards, but that's it. I don't know if that's the case for this project, but it could be for other ones. So I completely agree with what you're saying. I don't think I have a strong answer for you, but I think that there is a superficial buy-in to the idea of green, but that's as far as it goes. But I do think that people are receiving this message that because they have bought into the project, they are now protected. I think that's the strongest message. They can now stop caring. They can stop actively trying to solve things. They can just live their lives. Does that make sense? Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. Justin?
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I wonder, though, if green is an empty signifier, I can understand the appeal of using words like millenarian and apocalyptic, etc., but does that really have a purchase in what's going on there?
Okay. That's something that I've that I've wrestled with actually is through the project, does it have a meaning? Was that the end of your question? Or?
Yes, it is. It's just, this is a kind of a general, we've used the term, we've got so many different specialists in the room with different meanings, I think, to the word apocalyptic, millenarian, etc., etc. And this isn't to criticise at all what you said, because I think you've clearly opened up absolutely fascinating and totally reasonable, plausible interpretation of this. But I just wondered if the word... if green is an empty signifier, and it doesn't necessarily mean people are actually, when they hear about sustainability, maybe they've long ago forgotten what you're meant to be sustaining. It's just become a lifestyle sort of thing, and so it's now become devoid of even that kind of understanding of apocalyptic, sort of environmental apocalyptic, that sort of thing.
Okay. I think, to answer that question as well, the other half of my research is using film to kind of elucidate the collective dreams that society are having about apocalypticism and climate change. And in that analysis, which I didn't have time to touch upon in here, there is very much a feeling that climate change equals apocalypse, I think, so far. Perhaps Michael would disagree with me on that, but I'm not sure. So I think that that because of the fact that we have all these kind of climate change news stories coming out saying this will kill so many people by whenever, An Inconvenient Truth, The Day After Tomorrow, all these films that have come out to say, if we don't do something now, we will all die, effectively, or the wrong people will die, or whatever the message is. So I think that on a very subconscious level that goes in, but I also think that maybe those two things aren't directly related in the people's minds, but I hope that through my PhD, I can actually demonstrate the connection between those two. But it is something that I'm consciously trying to think of, whether it is just following a trend or whether there is actually a genuine link between those two concepts. So thank you for recognizing that in my work.
Other questions? Rupert? And then Charles.
You with the mic now. Yeah, thanks. Firstly, I don't think it's quite fair to say that green is an empty signifier.
Okay.
I would say it's not as empty, for example, as sustainable. I think one clue that it's not is the way that people talk about greenwashing, which implies that there is genuine green which has not been washed. In terms of the main thrust of your presentation, I'm very sympathetic. Just on the very point where you ended, you said maybe we're buying into an apocalypse of character by avoiding an apocalypse of climate. But I think it's also important to point out, as you implied in your answer to the first question, that we're also not actually avoiding an apocalypse of climate, right? In other words, what this project actually is development with some greenwash and some probably a few good green bits as well. And what we're actually doing in countries like this, we are a developing country. In the sense that, just like so-called developing countries, we're still going on and on and on, putting more infrastructure, more buildings, higher buildings, etc., etc. And all of this has a cost, an immediate cost, and a very long-term cost in terms of everything that's relevant to climate. So it seems to me that one of the messages we should also say to this is there's a pretense here of avoiding climate apocalypse, but not an actual avoidance.
Yes, I would completely agree with you actually on that last point. I think that the idea that green is an empty signifier, just to return to your original statement, I think has come from, for example, the University of Bristol is in Bristol, obviously, and Bristol was the European Green Capital in 2015. The only reason, I don't know if this is fair to say, but the only reason I've been told that they went for the European Green Capital is because they didn't get European Capital of Culture. So it enabled them to channel some money into projects that they wanted to fund anyway. That's a rumour that has circulated at least. So with that idea of green being just another way to get some money into the city, I think there was a purchase of 5 hybrid electric buses in Bristol. So there was somewhat of a buy-in, but not as big as you would expect from a European level initiative like that. Through that project, I then analysed news reports and academic literature as well to try and work out what it was that actually qualified something as being green. That's where the breakdown was. I think that green does have value as a signifier because it can mean certain things in certain situations, but I think in general it tends not to. So that's my critique of green. And I think that you are probably right about the an authentic avoidance of an apocalypse, because there isn't potentially an apocalypse. It's just going to be potentially a more and more dystopic future, perhaps. So I think it's something, again, that I don't have a clear answer to in my head, because it's, given the time constraints of this project, I'm trying to write a paper at the moment, these are things that I will include in the end, but at the moment they're not in my thinking, so thank you.
Yes, somewhat related to Rupert's question, and possibly you've partly answered it already. I was reminded with your peroration, your finale, of another seminal work. The very first time Darwin uses the word evolve in the Origin of Species is the very last word of the very last paragraph. Now, I was just wondering, when you said the apocalypse of character, I wished you'd gone on whose character and to what effect.
Yeah. That was more.
Could take us a bit further with that.
Yeah, that was more of a thinking tool, I think, rather than a conclusion. That was where I got to with the analysis. Was okay. So in terms of the natural apocalypse, if we can call it that, maybe there is some form of attempt to avoid, whether that be a significant and authentic attempt to avoid, or whether that be kind of a marketing ploy. The apocalypse of character. Who does it apply to? I'm not entirely sure at this stage. I think that it probably applies to the people who completely buy into the scheme and say, well, I'm now saving the world, and also are seeking out a community of other people who feel defenseless in the face of climate change, but actually are creating a very individualized, atomized world to live in doing that. I don't know if you noticed in the photo of the Outlooks elephant, most of the tables had 2 chairs. So there wasn't really a community being created there. It was more for couples or young professionals to go and hang out. My feeling is that people are being sold something that then they're not living, but think that they are living, if that makes sense. That's the more kind of apocalyptic character that I believe is in the project. I think the architects and the planners have just seen an opportunity to redevelop and sell some more housing in an area that has a housing shortage. And they're doing that through various signifiers that have worked in the past. The problem is that we're kind of kidding ourselves into believing that we are changing something authentically, when actually that thing may not need changing, and we're not authentically changing it even if it did, I think. Thank you.
One last question right here.
Just wanted to ask, what effect does what's happened in the last 2 weeks in relation to the fire? Is this going to have on, because you allude to the thing of the cladding?
Yeah.
And obviously the area that you're talking about is where the Haygate estate was, and that was cleared, and that was public, that was council housing that was removed. So it's also been the privatisation of large amounts of space.
Yeah.
But certainly this cladding thing is now in everyone's face.
Yeah.
How's that going to impact on what you're doing?
It's a very important point. I didn't really want to touch upon it in here because I couldn't give enough time to it. And obviously it's a very important and emotional issue as well. So I think with the buildings that are going up that are in these artistic renderings, it won't make any difference because they will already comply to the fire safety standards. With the redevelopment of the 60s tower block that we saw, obviously this was taken last year, so that wasn't even in our thoughts. Of course it would be done with the best equipment possible. But I do think that there will need to be a rethink. I want to go back to Elephant and Castle again in September, try and get 3 years worth of images to compare. And it would be very interesting to see what has happened to that 60s block that's being reclad. Whether anything has changed about the project or whether it's just going on as normal. My feeling is that there will have to be some minor change, but I mean, I'm not an architect or a planner, so I wouldn't like to comment too authoritatively on this. But it's got to make an impact in some way, I hope. Whether it will or not, it remains to be seen, I think.
Okay, thank you, Earl Harper.
Thank you.
Could I just ask, is there anybody here who won't be here tomorrow? Could you all make sure that you fill out one of our assessment forms, which are on a table right here? It's really important, just to tell us how we can improve, what you think, what you thought of today, and so on and so forth. So those forms are just behind Justin on that table right there. Just going to hold them up. Yep. And we'd be eternally grateful if you could take the time over the next half hour to fill them out. So we're going to take a break now, and then we're going to come back for Zeke Baker. So see you in half an hour. Okay.
Yeah, that's all fine.
So is Mike Hume coming?
Your
Mike Hume?
Unfortunately, well, I was just about to explain what's happened. He came to Bedford, and there's a family emergency, so he had to head to Norwich.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Because, of course, he's no colleague, so
Oh,
I
right,
was looking forward to seeing him.
Yeah, no, apparently his wife's in hospital.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Okay, welcome back, everyone. For the rest of this afternoon, we now have a recorded piece from Zeke Baker, who has produced a paper with John Hall. Yes, they're both at the University of California, Baker. Zeke did want to be here, but he couldn't make it, so we're going to play his recording, and then we're going to Skype with him as we did with Stefan earlier on. After Zeke, we were due to have John Hume here. Unfortunately, there's been a family emergency. He's had to go to Norwich. He did arrive in Bedford, but he had to immediately go. So I'll just be sort of winding up, and then I'll hand over to Justin, and he will wind up after me. So let's play that recording now.
Hi, my name is Zeke Baker. Today I'm giving a talk entitled Antinomies of Apocalypse, Social Temporalities Within Science, Religion, and the State. I sincerely apologize for not being in Bedford in person. Suffice it to say, I'm jealous of you all under the big top there. This talk is part of a project with myself and John R. Hall, my co-author, which uses alternative social temporalities, including the apocalyptic, as a way to analyze how climate futures are constructed between the social domains of religion, science, and the state across historical periods. In addition to emerging literature, including that of several conference participants here, it builds off John's work on the apocalypse and my own work on climate science and government. Let me begin with two guiding assumptions about climate and apocalypse. First, accounts of climate vary in relation to how social actors imagine and interpret their situations, a climate projection, if you will. Such accounts historically, as now, have involved one or another attempt to impose a particular order to nature, ranging from intimate to global scales, and not always reducible to a temporality bound to clocks, timelines, or even beginnings or ends. A guiding historical puzzle of this talk is how we got to a stabilized or normalized view of climate over the 19th century to a catastrophically destabilized view of climate and climate change today. Second, regarding the apocalypse, anxieties about the future are embedded in alternative ways of construing the apocalypse. The basic motif of apocalypse opposes synchronic religiosity centered on human existence in the eternity of time, as Durkheim famously discussed in the case of totemic religious experience. However, the apocalypse has many variants, related also to strategic and diachronic social temporalities that organize social meaning and domains of action. One accomplishment of modernization efforts over the past 2 centuries was to contain apocalyptic anxieties about a future marked by the end of the world as we know it, substituting institutions by which to rationalize temporality diachronically, that is, into a future that could be anticipated, demarcated, planned, and governed accordingly. And yet today it is a commonplace cultural trope that post-apocalyptic imaginaries involve survivalism under dystopia, often climatic catastrophe followed by a new totalitarian world of terror, suffering without end or reversal. What many consider a crisis of scientific authority in the US, paired with such popular cultural distillations of apocalypse, invite us to historicize the bases of alternative social temporalities. In this presentation, I limit myself to how the apocalyptic and salvation have come to be figured scientifically, especially in relation to Protestant Christian religious movements and political economic developments in the United States context, again with a focus on the former half of the 19th century. We begin with climate futures as they featured in Protestant apocalypticism. At its inception in the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation exploded with apocalyptic imagery, and some Puritans undertook emigration to escape the Babylon of the Roman Church to build a heaven on earth in New England. In this context, climate knowledge helped to make legible the work of Providence in a context otherwise marked by extreme hardship and vulnerability to unanticipated weather. As William Wood wrote in 1634 concerning, in his book, The Prospects of New England, "With divine pleasure and blessing," he writes, "English constitutions would thrive in the area's medicinable climate." The Pilgrims' redemptive quest to establish a city on the hill collapsed by the 1650s, but theological threads of colonization became deeply sewn into subsequent U.S. expansion across North America, extending the errand in the wilderness. On the one hand, waves of revivalism in the early and mid-19th century, what historians call Great Awakenings, filled some settlers with new light, enthusiasm, and a premillennial conviction that the second coming of Christ would occur before and indeed launch a millennial kingdom on earth. On the other hand, post-millennialists held that Christ would return only after God's followers built the millennial kingdom, so their project pushed any apocalypse at least 1,000 years into the future, leaving instead an increasingly diachronically organized world rationalized via clock and calendar. Rough-hewn, land-hungry pioneers pushing westward dealt with precarious life on the frontier, where the quest for salvation had an immediacy wrought by drought, floods, disease, crop failures, the unknown in general, and battles with Native Americans who sought to block their colonization. The pioneer focused, at least initially, was on survival in hostile lands. Salvation, therefore, was an immediate concern, and in hard circumstances, pioneers were especially susceptible to premillennial formulations about the last days. By contrast, postmillennialists sought to build the kingdom of God on earth, a collective project especially given to the rationalization of conduct, diachronic temporality that Max Weber identified within the Protestant ethic. Theirs was a civilizational project to tame a wilderness and to bring to it a Christian order. How did millenarian mission relate to climate as understood in the time? Leaving aside the often direct religious significance drawn from weather events, a millennial social temporality shaped how people viewed climate as a feature of providential nature that impinges on human history. In particular, diverse social actors sought to improve the climate-society relationship. To use the famous preacher Alexander's terms in 1840, the mission, quote, "to fill up the interior with all light and goodness, until the knowledge of the glory of the Lord cover the whole earth." This was expressed in religious conversion into a purified and expansive order that could express divine immanence within the apocalyptic present. Mormon theology, especially after migration to the Salt Lake Basin, similarly viewed Zion as a preparatory improvements through which Christ, in the upcoming last days, would build his temple. Already in 1834, Mormon leader Parley Pratt interpreted Genesis 1 in apocalyptic terms. He writes, "We learn in Genesis that there were neither deserts, barren places, nor stagnant swamps. No part of it was located in the frigid zone, so as to render its climate dreary and unproductive. The whole earth was probably one vast plain, well calculated for cultivation." End quote. After God's wrath would rain down elsewhere, he reasoned, the prophesied land of Zion would be, quote, "renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory of Edenic climate once again." For others in the more postmillennial interpretation, Western climates indicated divine revelation already in the here and now. As Presbyterian minister Lyman Beecher claimed in 1835, quote, "extending from the Allegheny to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the lakes of the North, the West represented, quote, the largest territory and most beneficent in climate and soil ever prepared for the habitation of man." He continued, "I perceive how God, who seeth the end from the beginning, had prepared the West to be mighty, and yet still wieldable." Still others were more attentive to the work of making climate so prepared. For physician Benjamin Rush, temperance could rebalance the effects of climate on health. He reasoned that the natural causes of disease, chiefly those of climate, were modified by, in his terms, moral causes that may be rectified through individual and public discipline. Ohio medical geographer Daniel Drake, writing in 1834, also a temperance activist, held a similar vision of improving the climate-society relationship through medical and social reforms that might reveal the providential development of the West as, in his words, a new world of man in the depths of the new world of history. Stefan Skrimshire recently discusses how apocalypse encompasses, in his words, not only eschatological or temporal disclosure, but also cosmic or spatial revelations. In the case of the early to mid-19th century American West, an apocalyptic temporality situated experiences and evaluations of new climates and territories as habitable and improvable by reference to a radical break with history and embrace of a spatially expansive apocalyptic present. But revelation and providential destiny, or millenarian mission, were not unique to the religious domain. How did scientific practices engender a discourse of climate in relation to these similar colonial and state-building developments? Parallel to restorationist clergy and postmillennial theologians, physicians and natural philosophers employed a logic of science to measure and evaluate through historical and statistical means the pattern developments of nature and its relationship to human society. Over the course of the 19th century, climate became a scientific category within such an evaluative context. Some Europeans had previously, in the late 18th century, interpreted American climates as degenerative to human capacities for civilization, understood as a social state achieved on the basis of natural climatic history, and stabilized especially through cultural practices specific to racial types, in their terms. In this context rife with climatic determinism, the primary aims of those developing meteorological records and climate statistics in the early U.S. reflected an anxiety concerning Europeans' health, moral, and civilizational and racial futures. These aims included explaining and curing diseases exhibited in racially and geographically specific circumstances, as well as evaluating possible changes to American climates, again understood as a metric of civilizational projects. Over the course of the 19th century, efforts to stitch climate knowledge into larger tapestries of state territorial expansion helped to construct Western territories as possibly ordered spaces, containing salubrious or healthy landscapes, and scattered with seeds of pre-civilization awaiting cultivation. From the standpoint of natural philosophers, frontier settlers, and state officials, such progress was hardly inevitable. And yet movements towards improvement of wilderness by cultivation, of savage-like behavior by social reform, and of public health by climate-specific medical police, they would denounce the specter of degenerative climates and degenerative social forces before they could take hold. As Army surgeon and climatologist Samuel Forey put it in 1842, quote, political institutions and social organization often struggle successfully against climatic agency. Now, what Forey meant here was, in his terms, that Anglo-Saxon whites had achieved a racial type on the basis of centuries of a congenial climatic influence and subsequent civilizing practices in Europe, and that this improvement process may be advanced in the US on a continental scale. Like articles of faith circulating through networks of itinerant preachers and tent revival meetings, matters of climatic fact likewise circulated through US society as a way of evaluating or advancing providential colonial destinies. Unlike apocalyptic revelations, however, scientists ordered time and climate in clearly diachronic terms. Such terms were critical to developments within the domain of the state, through which apocalyptic temporalities were to be contained and by which climate could be stabilized as an object of science and a component of governmentality. Civil religion by the mid-19th century inflected apocalyptic temporality, especially the historic mission of an expansive nation, into ritualized political discourse and state-making practices. Therefore, anxieties regarding degenerative or unhealthy climates, like those regarding imminence of the Christ's second coming, gave way to a rationalized view of climate and a more ambivalent significance of apocalyptic climates to the developments in nation-state building. Seeing like a state does not mean state actors reject apocalyptic temporalities or cosmic visions of rule, but they often seek to contain them, insofar as they remain unwieldy to strategic and bureaucratic governing of territories, time, and social relations. Recall the slave rebel Nat Turner's confession. In his words, "It was plain to me that the Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men. On the appearance of the sign, the eclipse of the sun last February, he reasoned, I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons. Such interventions of the apocalyptic into political order, notwithstanding, millennial discourse articulated with state strategies, especially to expand territory and facilitate settler colonialism in the American West. What came of climate, therefore, through the process of state formation? With developing meteorological observation networks and collecting information, especially of unknown climates in the West, sought to record, register, and tabulate their findings. Military medical officials compiled their weather logs to evaluate hospital design, soldiers' proper regimen, and especially the effects of climate on army diseases. Federally sanctioned explorers were similarly charged with evaluating the habitability and security of those areas. Meteorologists by the 1850s emerged as state-sponsored scientists in large part on this basis. Improvements to the climate-society relationship for revivalists may have represented an apocalyptic break in the temporal economy of divine movement within history. But for state actors, knowing climate and securing providential expansion were usefully contained when climate could be represented as an orderly system, the dynamics of which could be made legible in diachronic time. In this way, the dialectic between unknown climates and apocalyptic temporality was contained through efforts to map climate futures onto increasingly demarcated territories and calendrical representations of time and nature. So in the elective affinity between religious post-millennialism and secular manifest destiny, a program of climate stabilization came to predominate in elite U.S. culture. The pursuit of climate knowledge and programs of salvation could proceed separately, yet reinforce one another, and without science seriously considering climate futures as distinct from the trajectory of progress. Although I can't expand on it here, this construction of climate as a stable, normalized, geographic category developed further through a clear affinity with industrial capitalism, especially prominent in the development of agricultural climatology and weather prediction by the turn of the 20th century. To be clear then, it is this historical stabilization of climate that gets so destabilized by global climate change. And just as this stability has involved the scientific channeling of apocalypticism and providence through the state, climate change now involves the dialectic reshuffling of social temporality across the domains of religion, science, and the state yet again. Of climate change by the mid-20th century meant that prior assumptions of stability had begun to be overturned. But the dominant logic of positivism meant that knowledge about climate changes continued to be understood as a component of general scientific and social progress. Developments of longer-range forecasting, weather forecasting, and climate modification programs, to cite two important research agendas, articulated with the spirit of post-World War II positivism. Thus, when climate futures again became important to science, they were embedded within a strategic temporality that subjected them to calculation, or in the case of climate control, tactical intervention. As with post-millennial religious future, the secular future of climate came to matter as a site of strategic anticipation. Indeed, early studies into anthropogenic global warming treated it as either a social good or subject to rational technical management most of the time. However, this progressive secular future was strongly undercut by historical and scientific developments in the 1960s, especially the Cold War nuclear threat, its possible catastrophic climate impact, or nuclear winter, and global warming studies that began to emerge by the late 1960s. Challenges to the positivist discourse of progress through climate science occurred on several fronts. The discourse of modification in climate modification previously involved studies into weather manipulation and efforts to modify climates. Now it shifted from a story about progressive mastery of the future to a restoration narrative, thus the landmark U.S. President Scientific Advisory Committee in 1965, their report, Restoring the Quality of Our Environment. Investigations of what, in a turn of phrase, became called inadvertent climate modification, they treated human social emissions as pollution, disturbing an otherwise natural equilibrium. Mathematical investigations, moreover, of large-scale and long time-scale atmospheric processes also rendered climate dynamics as possibly chaotic, displacing the prefigured order that many scientists believed they would eventually uncover. Modification not as mastery, but as restoration, chaos, nonlinearity, and emergingly catastrophe. Such were the temporal shifts of climate science against its own positivistic base. Climate science today thus faces a tension between a legacy of secular positivism and simulations of futures entailing possibly catastrophic geophysical, ecological, and social developments. Dominant approaches to climate change policy have clustered around constructing scenarios, providing one way to contain apocalyptic catastrophe by placing scientific constructions of the future on the axis again of diachronic time and policy decision-making characteristic of modern bureaucratic order. Leaving aside for now the clear possibility of invoking a theological or agnostic form of dominionism, visible in Donald Trump and among Christian premillennialists sometimes, which rejects climate science outright, governance by scenarios yields the strategic capacity to evaluate climate future alternatives and to securitize them. For state actors, climate change can be either quantified in monetary terms or qualitatively assessed as trade-offs in a balance of burdens versus future threats, including to national security, economic growth, and energy and humanitarian crises. These considerations rest on a central logic that folds analysis of climate dynamics into a policy economy of risks, impacts, costs, and benefits. For many climate scientists, however, framing the implications of research within the confines of diachronic temporality does not make sense. When envisioning the civilizational significance of abrupt, irreversible ecological change, issues of salvation loom large. Thus, climate scientist James Hansen argues in 2009 for sweeping regulation of fossil fuels to sustain even the grim hope of maintaining a barely habitable planet in coming centuries. His scientific papers emphasizing nonlinear feedbacks produce sea level rise and reject envisioning global warming impacts as incremental developments subject to the tweaking of policymakers. If a sustainable human civilization is to persist, climate society imbalance requires restorative action, Mark Linus argues in his 2011 book entitled The God Species. Restoration to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide climate boundary of sustainable human society, to be specific in his case. As of now, such prophetic disclosures are less likely to affect the dominant climate policy regime, insofar as they obscure efforts to render climate futures legible diachronically. Yet clearly such changes in climate expertise indicate a temporal fracture between positivist science as a basis of diachronic treatment of the future and apocalyptic science concerned with collective salvation. Apocalyptic disclosures advanced by climate scientists may inspire diverse actions, of course, like religious visions, helping to advance or fragment collective hopes for salvation in the face of suffering and cosmic precariousness. For climate scientists, as with Christians who reject premillennialism, saving individual souls is not what is at stake here. It is the planet that must be saved if humanity is not to face a dystopian collapse of civilization as we know it. Yet for science to chart a path for salvation in the face of anticipated apocalyptic developments would clearly be a disruption of power relations in both the domains of religion and within the state. Among scientists themselves, a postmillennialist style of hope flirts with such extreme strategic interventions like geoengineering the planet. Only several decades ago, scientists were the harbingers of progressive secular developments, often indifferent to religion, much less salvation or apocalypse. We have yet to understand how institutionally authorized forms of future construction, whether scientific or religious, may develop broad alternatives to the currently polarizing discourse that divides scientific projections from religious meaning, salvation of the Cartesian human from survival of human ecologies, and from futures characterized by end times apocalypse from many people's ambivalent orientation toward anything but the here and now. So the question remains, whence a future that escapes the traps that have beset both modern science and religion, historically and today? Neither in itself nor with the other will science or religion be adequate to the global institutional challenge of climate change. Yet the dialectic of the two over the climate apocalypse is important to such concerns because it makes starkly legible how actors in religious and scientific domains are reimagining future relations between human culture, knowledge, and ecological experience. Thanks a lot. I welcome your questions and comments.
Okay, we're going to try and get Zeke on Skype now. There he is. Hi, Zeke.
I can see you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah?
And we can hear you. It's working well.
All right, good.
Okay, so I'm going to ask people, we've just finished looking at your recording, so I'm going to ask people if they have any questions.
All right, great, thanks.
Questions for Zeke? No questions? I think one person is asking, where's John Hall?
I can hear you, yeah.
One person asked, where is John Hall? They wanted to see John Hall.
John is watching this from his house in Santa Cruz, but he couldn't be here.
Okay. Questions? Zeke, we do not have any questions for you.
No questions.
Oh, there's one here. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Question from Richard.
Hey, one thing I was wondering was because I was quite intrigued by what you were saying about the advent of religious language in a lot of previously secular scientific discourse. To what extent do you think that that's something which sits in consonance with religious presentations of apocalypse, and to what extent would you see that as something which is now so dissonant that no agreement between those two different kinds of catastrophism can be possible?
So by that, you're specifically talking about recent developments in climate science and the sort of adoption of a salvation narrative, just to clarify?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like it sort of demands some speculation on that question. I mean, I think there's some movements within climate science, towards religious engagement. Now, it's not exactly over, certainly not over religious orientations to the apocalypse, but it is more about the failure of politics by traditional means. So I'm thinking of a paper written in Science a couple of years ago. I'm blanking on the atmospheric scientist involved in it that is calling for sort of calling on religious authorities for the capacities for mass mobilization of popular opinion. And so I think the elements of fruitful relationship between religion and science is happening, and it can't be written off. Whether those visions of apocalypse are indeed compatible, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, just to follow on for that, I know that some people here will have met Joe Webster before because he was involved in one of the previous activities. But Joe Webster, I don't know if you have come across his paper on engagement, skepticism about climate change among fishermen in Scotland, much of which is on the basis that what it's presenting is a false eschatology. And I think that's very interesting, but I'm kind of thinking, surely there has to be another side to the story here, where in a sense this convergence of eschatologies might be productive rather than something which would necessarily lead to contradiction. But anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Are there? I can't see. Are there other questions?
There's another question from Chris Rowland back here.
Great, thanks.
Hello, thank you very much. This question's coming from a biblical studies background, and I'd just simply like you to tell me what you think apocalyptic temporalities are.
So I'm approaching it, perhaps from a different perspective, but essentially what I'm looking at apocalyptic temporality is as a social temporality, insofar as it organizes how people approach their social experience in the here and now in reference to the end of the world as we know it, essentially. And of course, there's multiple formulations of that. And then I think that the significance of the way that we draw that out as an ideal type in the period that we're looking at in relation to, what in our formulation we're calling diachronic temporality, is that, there are always multiple registers of time, and part of the development of climate knowledge within diachronic temporality is a foreclosure or a containment of apocalyptic climates, which climate knowledge is, in various historical circumstances, climate has been pinned to apocalyptic futures. But I would welcome your elaborated critique on that for sure.
Some of us here today have been querying the baggage which the term apocalyptic can bring with it. And I wonder if that's relevant to what you're saying. Because, let me just put it in this way. So you have somebody like James Hansen or Kevin Anderson who are giving dire warnings about what's going to happen unless we get our shit together. And I worry that sometimes people like that are called apocalypse mongers or what have you, when it seems to me what they should be called is heroes, and people who are daring to tell the truth and face reality, which is not the same as prophesying doom. It's saying it's a hypothetical, right? Unless we so and so, then such and such. Do you empathise with my concern here, and if you do you think that we should be cautious about kind of the way that we liken scientists to some religious eschatological figures, etc.?
Yeah, I certainly take note of that tension. I think my approach to science and to scientists in this study is not to draw definitive boundaries around prophecy or prediction. In sort of the heroic sense. I'm in a word, I'm very sympathetic to to those that sort of point to nonlinear feedbacks and those sorts of things. And as I mentioned in the talk, I think that given the policy, the orientation to time within policy making, that those scientific interventions are likely to be underplayed. This has been shown time and time again within the cases of IPCC reports and their uptake in policy, that it's bureaucratic planning that cannot deal with those kinds of scientific interventions. So calling those apocalyptic is not to, it's certainly not to denigrate them or to say that they're sort of on par with fantasy or anything of that nature. But calling it apocalyptic science, if anything, sort of casts it into relief with other orientations to time, which, as others have noted, may or may not be useful or practical in dealing with an issue like climate change.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got one last question, Zeke from Ariel Hesiod.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Zeke. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. If I understood you correctly, you suggested at the beginning that the colonization of, say, Massachusetts and other parts of North America was interpreted through a providential lens by contemporaries, which, if so, is uncontested. But could you clarify, when does science seem to be coming into your story much later in the 19th century? Is that right? Or have I misunderstood you?
No, it's correct.
Yeah, in which case, my question would be, why isn't it not much earlier in the story? Because one of the imperatives that's also driving the colonization is early modern understandings of science. For example, a Baconian great instauration in tandem with the providentialism, and that really what I'm suggesting is that the science should come earlier into your picture, as early moderns would have understood it.
Sure. I'm not as familiar with, at least in my own work, with sort of early modern climate knowledge. Although, I've read a lot of those works. I mainly sort of wanted to frame. I wanted to use sort of, Puritanism and emigration as a way to sort of frame, a basic understanding of later developments and manifest destiny on which they were based. It's not climate knowledge, and I used a quote from William Wood in the mid 17th century, and climate concerns around climate were, I think, roughly compatible between really the mid 19th century and the mid 18th century, at least. Concerns around climate and disease, concerns around habitability, concerns not quite race, but concerns around national constitutions in their terms, concerns around climate change in early America. Others have written on that. I wouldn't say that science only comes in later, but it was that that specifically. I just kind of carved out a piece of time in the early 19th century to look at that.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I know we're running out of time. I could come back, but I know we're.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we're running out of time.
Great.
Okay, Zeke, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Stu. I apologize I can't be there. Thank you for listening.
Next time we'll see you here.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Zach.
Okay, we're going to get Justin mic'd up. Okay, yeah, we can do that. I personally wanted, just before we do that, I wanted to thank you all so much for all your fantastic questions and your involvement today. It's been really brilliant. Tomorrow is another day, so we're going to have another full day of equally impressive discussions and presentations. So I hope as many of you as possible will be able to join us for that. And I should mention that for delegates, we're going to meet for drinks at the Swan Hotel, which is the Georgian-looking hotel just at the town bridge, just down the road there, down the embankment. And then we're going to have dinner at 7 o'clock. And that's for delegates. So for everybody else, we will have more sandwiches and coffee, and we'll be slumming it again tomorrow. So, Justin.
Well, I think a lot of you were here when I started off things this morning, and I'm meant to wrap things up now. And it says discussant, sort of a response to the papers. But it's been an incredibly rich day with a lot of fascinating papers, both individually but also collectively. For me, frankly, the diversity of different perspectives has generated a lot of thoughts in my mind, which I really didn't think I'd have on this subject. So it's been
very helpful indeed for me. And what I really wouldn't want to do, and I know it sounds like I'm trying to get out of giving you another talk, is impose my own interpretation on this range of talks and leave you probably with a completely misreading of a number of these talks and leave that as your thought in your mind as you leave. The wonderful thing about today is that it's all recorded, and whilst this may not be exactly what people will be looking at, I'm sure they will be looking at the individual talks. So you can look at them again for yourself and see what was going on there, and I think there's an awful lot to think about. But having said that, I'd like to thank you all, of course, for coming today. I know some of you won't be here tomorrow, but thank you so much for being here today. So obviously thank you to the speakers, thank you to the participants, thank you to the team, and thank you to those who are watching now and in the future, because despite all the talk today, I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to rack up at least a few viewers before the end of the world. And what I would also like to say is that at this point, although I really don't want to contribute anything more, I'm going to say a few more things tomorrow. If there's a burning sort of question or observation about the papers that we've had today, perhaps connections between them or issues that need resolving or whatever that you'd like to raise now, then please feel free to, if there's something that people would really feel they need to say, want to say. But just as there's a moment of silence in the book of Revelation, so silence isn't a bad thing either. Nothing? Well, on that note, I hope you'll continue your conversations over drinks and what have you, and I'll see a number of you tomorrow. For those who I won't see, thank you once again. So thanks a lot.
If people aren't going to take away these, please leave them on the table there because we can reuse them for tomorrow. Thank you very much.